Chapter 18 of The Jacket by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Barry Eads. Chapter 18. Suspended animation is nothing new, not alone in the vegetable world and in the lower forms of animal life, but in the highly evolved complex organism of man himself. A cataleptic trance is a cataleptic trance, no matter how induced. From time immemorial, the fakir of India has been able voluntarily to induce such states in himself. It is an old trick of the fakirs to have themselves buried alive. Other men in similar trances have misled the physicians, who pronounced them dead and gave the orders to put them alive under the ground. As my jacket experiences in San Quentin continued, I dwelt not a little on this problem of suspended animation. I remembered having read that the far northern Siberian peasants made a practice of hibernating through the long winters, just as bears and other wild animals do. Some scientists studied these peasants and found that during these periods of the long sleep, respiration and digestion practically ceased, and that the heart was at so low tension as to defy detection by ordinary layman's examination. In such a trance, the bodily processes are so near to absolute suspension that the air and food consumed are practically negligible. On this reasoning, partly, was based my defiance of Warden Atherton and Dr. Jackson. It was thus that I dared challenge them to give me 100 days in the jacket, and they did not dare accept my challenge. Nevertheless, I did manage to do without water, as well as food, during my 10 days' bouts. I found it an intolerable nuisance in the depths of dream across space and time to be haled back to the sordid present by a despicable prison doctor pressing water to my lips. So I warned Dr. Jackson, first, that I intended doing without water while in the jacket, and next, that I would resist any efforts to compel me to drink. Of course, we had our little struggle, but after several attempts, Dr. Jackson gave it up. Thereafter, the space occupied in Darrell Standing's life by a jacket bout was scarcely more than a few ticks of the clock. Immediately I was laced, I devoted myself to inducing the little death. From practice it became simple and easy. I suspended animation and consciousness so quickly that I escaped the really terrible suffering consequent upon suspended circulation. Most quickly came the dark, and the next I, Darrell Standing, knew was the light again, the faces bending over me as I was unlaced, and the knowledge that 10 days had passed in the twinkling of an eye. But oh, the wonder and the glory of those 10 days spent by me elsewhere! The journeys through the long chain of existences, the long darks, the growings of nebulous lights, and the fluttering apparitional selves that dawn through the growing light. Much have I pondered upon the relation of these and other selves to me, and of the relation of the total experience to the modern doctrine of evolution. I can truly say that my experience is in complete accord with our conclusions of evolution. I, like any man, am a growth. I did not begin when I was born, nor when I was conceived. I have been growing, developing, through incalculable myriads of millenniums. All these experiences of all these lives, and of countless other lives, have gone to the making of the soul stuff or the spirit stuff that is I. Don't you see? They are the stuff of me. Matter does not remember, for spirit is memory. I am this spirit compounded of the memories of my endless incarnations. Whence came in me, Darrell Standing, the red pulse of wrath that has wrecked my life and put me in the condemned cells? Surely it did not come into being, was not created, when the babe that was to be Darrell Standing was conceived. That old red wrath is far older than my mother, far older than the oldest and first mother of men. My mother, at my inception, did not create that passionate lack of fear that is mine. Not all the mothers of the whole evolution of men manufactured fear or fearlessness in men. Far back beyond the first men were fear and fearlessness, love, hatred, anger, all the emotions, growing, developing, becoming the stuff that was to become men. I am all of my past, as every protagonist of the Mendelian law must agree. All my previous selves have their voices, echoes, promptings in me. My every mode of action, heat of passion, flicker of thought is shaded, toned, infinitesimally shaded and toned, by that vast array of other selves that preceded me and went into the making of me. The stuff of life is plastic. At the same time, this stuff never forgets. Mold it as you will, the old memories persist. All manner of horses, from ton shires to dwarf Shetlands, have been bred up and down from those first wild ponies domesticated by primitive man. Yet to this day man has not bred out the kick of the horse, and I, who am composed of those first horse-tamers, have not had their red anger bred out of me. I am man born of woman. My days are few, but the stuff of me is indestructible. I have been woman born of woman. I have been a woman and borne my children, and I shall be born again. Oh, incalculable times again shall I be born, and yet the stupid dolts about me think that by stretching my neck with a rope they will make me cease. Yes, I shall be hanged, soon. This is the end of June. In a little while they will try to befool me. They will take me from this cell to the bath, according to the prison custom of the weekly bath. But I shall not be brought back to this cell. I shall be dressed outright in fresh clothes and be taken to the death cell. There they will place the death watch on me. Night or day, waking or sleeping, I shall be watched. I shall not be permitted to put my head under the blankets, for fear I may anticipate the state by choking myself. Always bright light will blaze upon me, and then, when they have well wearied me, they will lead me out one morning in a shirt without a collar and drop me through the trap. Oh, I know. The rope they will do it with is well stretched. For many a month now the hangman of Folsom has been stretching it with heavy weights so as to take the spring out of it. Yes, I shall drop far. They have cunning tables of calculations, like interest tables, that show the distance of the drop in relation to the victim's weight. I am so emaciated that they will have to drop me far in order to break my neck. And then the onlookers will take their hats off, and as I swing, the doctors will press their ears to my chest to count my fading heartbeats, and at last they will say that I am dead. It is grotesque. It is the ridiculous effrontery of men-maggots who think they can kill me. I cannot die. I am immortal, as they are immortal. The difference is that I know it, and they do not know it. Pah! I was once a hangman, or an executioner, rather. Well, I remember it. I used the sword, not the rope. The sword is the braver way, although all ways are equally inefficacious. Forsooth, as if spirit could be thrust through with steel or throttled by a rope. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19, Part 1, of The Jacket, by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Barry Eads. Next to Oppenheimer and Morrell, who rotted with me through the years of darkness, I was considered the most dangerous prisoner in San Quentin. On the other hand, I was considered the toughest, tougher even than Oppenheimer and Morrell. Of course, by toughness I mean enduringness. Terrible as were the attempts to break them in body and in spirit, more terrible were the attempts to break me. And I endured. Dynamite or curtains had been Warden Atherton's ultimatum. And in the end, it was neither. I could not produce the dynamite, and Warden Atherton could not induce the curtains. It was not because my body was enduring, but because my spirit was enduring. And it was because, in earlier existences, my spirit had been wrought to steel hardness by steel-hard experiences. There was one experience that for long was a sort of nightmare to me. It had neither beginning nor end. Always I found myself on a rocky, surge-battered islet, so low that in storms the salt spray swept over its highest point. It rained much. I lived in a lair and suffered greatly, for I was without fire and lived on uncooked meat. Always I suffered. It was the middle of some experience to which I could get no clue. And since, when I went into the little death, I had no power of directing my journeys, I often found myself reliving this particularly detestable experience. My only happy moments were when the sun shone, at which times I basked on the rocks and thawed out the almost perpetual chill I suffered. My one diversion was an oar and a jackknife. Upon this oar I spent much time, carving minute letters and cutting a notch for each week that passed. There were many notches. I sharpened the knife on a flat piece of rock, and no barber was ever more careful of his favorite razor than was I of that knife. Nor did ever a miser prize his treasure as did I prize the knife. It was as precious to me. It was as precious as my life. In truth, it was my life. By many repetitions I managed to bring back out of the jacket the legend that was carved on the oar. At first I could bring but little. Later it grew easier, a matter of piecing portions together. And at last I had the thing complete. Here it is. This is to acquaint the person into whose hands this oar may fall, that Daniel Foss, a native of Elkton in Maryland, one of the United States of America, and who sailed from the port of Philadelphia in 1809 on board the brig Negotiator, bound to the Friendly Islands, was cast upon this desolate island the February following, where he erected a hut and lived a number of years, subsisting on seals. He being the last who survived of the crew of said brig, which ran foul of an island of ice and foundered on the 25th November, 1809. There it was, quite clear. By this means I learned a lot about myself. One vexed point, however, I never did succeed in clearing up. Was this island situated in the far South Pacific or the far South Atlantic? I did not know enough of sailing ship tracks to be certain whether the brig Negotiator would sail for the Friendly Islands via Cape Horn or via the Cape of Good Hope. To confess my own ignorance, not until after I was transferred to Folsom did I learn in which ocean were the Friendly Islands. The Japanese murderer, whom I have mentioned before, had been a sailmaker on board the Arthur Sewall ships, and he told me that the probable sailing course would be by way of the Cape of Good Hope. If this were so, then the dates of sailing from Philadelphia and of being wrecked would easily determine which ocean. Unfortunately, the sailing date is merely 1809. The wreck might as likely have occurred in one ocean as the other. Only once did I, in my trances, get a hint of the period preceding the time spent on the island. This begins at the moment of the brig's collision with the iceberg, and I shall narrate it, if for no other reason, at least to give an account of my curiously cool and deliberate conduct. This conduct at this time, as you shall see, was what enabled me in the end to survive alone of all the ship's company. I was awakened, in my bunk in the forecastle, by a terrific crash. In fact, as was true of the other 6 sleeping men of the watch below, awaking and leaping from bunk to floor were simultaneous. We knew what had happened. The others waited for nothing, rushing only partly clad upon deck. But I knew what to expect, and I did wait. I knew that if we escaped at all, it would be by the longboat. No man could swim in so freezing a sea, and no man, thinly clad, could live long in the open boat. Also, I knew just about how long it would take to launch the boat. So by the light of the wildly swinging slush lamp, to the tumult on deck, and to cries of "She's sinking," I proceeded to ransack my sea chest for suitable garments. Also, since they would never use them again, I ransacked the sea chests of my shipmates. Working quickly but collectedly, I took nothing but the warmest and stoutest of clothes. I put on the 4 best woolen shirts the forecastle boasted, 3 pairs of pants, and 3 pairs of thick woolen socks. So large were my feet thus encased that I could not put on my own good boots. Instead, I thrust on Nicholas Wilton's new boots, which were larger and even stouter than mine. Also, I put on Jeremy Naylor's pea jacket over my own, and outside of both put on Seth Richards' thick canvas coat, which I remembered he had fresh oiled only a short while previous. 2 pairs of heavy mittens, John Roberts' muffler, which his mother had knitted for him, and Joseph Dawes' beaver cap atop my own, both bearing ear and neck flaps, completed my outfitting. The shouts that the brig was sinking redoubled, but I took a minute longer to fill my pockets with all the plug tobacco I could lay my hands on. Then I climbed out on deck, and not a moment too soon. The moon, bursting through a crack of cloud, showed a bleak and savage picture. Everywhere was wrecked gear, and everywhere was ice. The ships, ropes, and spars of the mainmast, which was still standing, were fringed with icicles. and there came over me a feeling almost of relief in that never again should I have to pull and haul on the stiff tackles and hammer ice so that the frozen ropes could run through the frozen shivs. The wind, blowing half a gale, cut with the sharpness that is a sign of the proximity of icebergs, and the big seas were bitter cold to look upon in the moonlight. The longboat was lowering away to starboard, and I saw men, struggling on the ice-sheeted deck with barrels of provisions, abandon the food in their haste to get away. In vain, Captain Nicholl strove with them. A sea, breaching across from windward, settled the matter and sent them, leaping over the rail in heaps. I gained the captain's shoulder, and, holding on to him, I shouted in his ear that if he would board the boat and prevent the men from casting off, I would attend to the provisioning. Little time was given me, however. Scarcely had I managed, helped by the second mate, Aaron Northrup, to lower away half a dozen barrels and kegs, when all cried from the boat that they were casting off. Good reason they had. Down upon us from windward was drifting a towering ice mountain, while to leeward, close aboard, was another ice mountain upon which we were driving. Quicker in his leap was Aaron Northrup. I delayed a moment, even as the boat was shoving away, in order to select a spot amidships where the men were thickest, so that their bodies might break my fall. I was not minded to embark with a broken member on so hazardous a voyage in the longboat. That the men might have room at the oars, I worked my way quickly aft into the stern sheets. Certainly I had other and sufficient reasons. It would be more comfortable in the stern sheets than in the narrow bow, and further, it would be well to be near the afterguard in whatever troubles that were sure to arise under such circumstances in the days to come. In the stern sheets were the mate, Walter Drake, the surgeon, Arnold Benthorn, Aaron Northrup, and Captain Nicholl, who was steering. The surgeon was bending over Northrup, who lay in the bottom groaning. Not so fortunate had he been in his ill-considered leap, for he had broken his right leg at the hip joint. There was little time for him then, however, for we were laboring in a heavy sea directly between the two ice islands that were rushing together. Nicholas Wilton, at the stroke oar, was cramped for room, so I better stowed the barrels, and kneeling and facing him, was able to add my weight to the oar. Forward I could see John Roberts straining at the bow oar. Pulling on his shoulders from behind, Arthur Haskins and the boy, Benny Hardwater, added their weight to his. In fact, so eager were all hands to help that more than one was thus in the way and cluttered the movements of the rowers. It was close work, but we went clear by a matter of 100 yards, so that I was able to turn my head and see the untimely end of the negotiator. She was caught squarely in the pinch, and she was squeezed between the ice as a sugar-plum might be squeezed between thumb and forefinger of a boy. In the shouting of the wind and the roar of the water we heard nothing, although the crack of the brig's stout ribs and deck beams must have been enough to awaken a hamlet on a peaceful night. Silently, easily, the brig's sides squeezed together, the deck bulged up, and the crushed remnant dropped down and was gone, while where she had been was occupied by the grinding conflict of the ice islands. I felt regret at the destruction of this haven against the elements, but at the same time was well pleased at thought of my snugness inside my 4 shirts and 3 coats. Yet it proved a bitter night, even for me. I was the warmest clad in the boat. What the others must have suffered I did not care to dwell upon overmuch. For fear that we might meet up with more ice in the darkness, we bailed and held the boat bow on to the seas. And continually, now with one mitten, now with the other, I rubbed my nose that it might not freeze. Also, with memories lively in me of the home circle in Elkton, I prayed to God. In the morning we took stock. To commence with, all but 2 or 3 had suffered frostbite. Aaron Northrup, unable to move because of his broken hip, was very bad. It was the surgeon's opinion that both of Northrup's feet were hopelessly frozen. The longboat was deep and heavy in the water, for it was burdened by the entire ship's company of 21. 2 of these were boys. Benny Hardwater was a bare 13, and Lish Dickory, whose family was near neighbor to mine in Elkton, was just turned 16. Our provisions consisted of 300 weight of beef and 200 weight of pork. The half-dozen loaves of brine-pulped bread which the cook had brought did not count. Then there were 3 small barrels of water and 1 small keg of beer. Captain Nicholl frankly admitted that in this uncharted ocean he had no knowledge of any near land. The one thing to do was to run for more clement climate, which we accordingly did, setting our small sail and steering quartering before the fresh wind to the northeast. The food problem was simple arithmetic. We did not count Aaron Northrup, for we knew he would soon be gone. At £1 per day, our 500 pounds would last us 25 days. At half a pound, it would last 50. So half a pound had it. I divided and issued the meat under the captain's eyes, and managed it fairly enough, God knows, although some of the men grumbled from the first. Also, from time to time, I made fair provision among the men of the plug tobacco I had stowed in my many pockets, a thing which I could not but regret, especially when I knew it was being wasted on this man and that, who I was certain could not live a day more, or at best 2 days or 3. For we began to die soon in the open boat. Not to starvation, but to the killing cold and exposure were those earlier deaths due. It was a matter of the survival of the toughest and the luckiest. I was tough by constitution, and lucky inasmuch as I was warmly clad and had not broken my leg like Aaron Northrup. Even so strong was he that despite being the first to be severely frozen, he was days in passing. Vance Hathaway was the first. We found him in the gray of dawn, crouched double in the bow and frozen stiff. The boy, Lish Dickory, was the second to go. The other boy, Benny Hardwater, lasted 10 or a dozen days. So bitter was it in the boat that our water and beer froze solid, and it was a difficult task justly to apportion the pieces I broke off with Northrup's clasp knife. These pieces we put in our mouths and sucked till they melted. Also, on occasion of snow squalls, we had all the snow we desired, all of which was not good for us, causing a fever of inflammation to attack our mouths so that the membranes were continually dry and burning, and there was no allaying a thirst so generated. To suck more ice or snow was merely to aggravate the inflammation. More than anything else, I think it was this that caused the death of Lish Dickory. He was out of his head and raving for 24 hours before he died. He died babbling for water, and yet he did not die for need of water. I resisted as much as possible the temptation to suck ice, contenting myself with a shred of tobacco in my cheek, and made out with fair comfort. We stripped all clothing from our dead. Stark they came into the world, and stark they passed out over the side of the longboat and down into the dark, freezing ocean. Lots were cast for the clothes. This was by Captain Nicholl's command, in order to prevent quarreling. It was no time for the follies of sentiment. There was not one of us who did not know secret satisfaction at the occurrence of each death. Luckiest of all was Israel Stickney in casting lots, so that in the end, when he passed, he was a veritable treasure trove of clothing. It gave a new lease of life to the survivors. We continued to run to the northeast before the fresh westerlies, but our quest for warmer weather seemed vain. Ever the spray froze in the bottom of the boat, and I still chipped beer and drinking water with Northrup's knife. My own knife I reserved. It was of good steel, with a keen edge and stoutly fashioned, and I did not care to peril it in such manner. By the time half our company was overboard, the boat had a reasonably high freeboard, and was less ticklish to handle in the gusts. Likewise, there was more room for a man to stretch out comfortably. A source of continual grumbling was the food. The captain, the mate, the surgeon, and myself, talking it over, resolved not to increase the daily whack of half a pound of meat. The 6 sailors, for whom Tobias Snow made himself spokesman, contended that the death of half of us was equivalent to a doubling of our provisioning, and that therefore the ration should be increased to a pound. In reply, we of the afterguard pointed out that it was our chance for life that was doubled, did we but bear with the half-pound ration. It is true that 8 ounces of salt meat did not go far in enabling us to live and to resist the severe cold. We were quite weak, and because of our weakness we frosted easily. Noses and cheeks were all black with frostbite. It was impossible to be warm, although we now had double the garments we had started with. 5 weeks after the loss of the negotiator, the trouble over the food came to a head. I was asleep at the time. It was night, when Captain Nicholl caught Judge Hetchkins stealing from the pork barrel. That he was abetted by the other 5 men was proved by their actions. Immediately Judge Hetchkins was discovered, the whole 6 threw themselves upon us with their knives. It was close, sharp work in the dim light of the stars, and it was a mercy the boat was not overturned. I had reason to be thankful for my many shirts and coats, which served me as an armor. The knife thrusts scarcely more than drew blood through the so great thickness of cloth, although I was scratched to bleeding in a round dozen of places. The others were similarly protected, and the fight would have ended in no more than a mauling all around, had not the mate, Walter Dakin, a very powerful man, hit upon the idea of ending the matter by tossing the mutineers overboard. This was joined in by Captain Nicholl, the surgeon, and myself, and in a trice 5 of the 6 were in the water and clinging to the gunwale. Captain Nicholl and the surgeon were busy amidships with the 6th, Jeremy Naylor, and were in the act of throwing him overboard, while the mate was occupied with wrapping fingers along the gunwale with a boat stretcher. For the moment I had nothing to do, and so was able to observe the tragic end of the mate. As he lifted the stretcher to wrap Seth Richards' fingers, the latter, sinking down low in the water and then jerking himself up by both hands, sprang half into the boat, locked his arms around the mate, and falling backward and outboard, dragged the mate with him. Doubtlessly he never relaxed his grip, and both drowned together. Thus, left alive of the entire ship's company were 3 of us: Captain Nicholl, Arnold Bentham, the surgeon, and myself. 7 had gone in the twinkling of an eye, consequent on Judge Hetchkins's attempt to steal provisions. And to me it seemed a pity that so much good warm clothing had been wasted there in the sea. There was not one of us who could have managed gratefully with more. Captain Nicholl and the surgeon were good men and honest. Often enough, when 2 of us slept, the one awake and steering could have stolen from the meat. But this never happened. We trusted one another fully, and we would have died rather than betray that trust. We continued to content ourselves with half a pound of meat each per day, and we took advantage of every favoring breeze to work to the northward. Not until January 14th, 7 weeks since the wreck, did we come up with a warmer latitude. Even then it was not really warm. It was merely not so bitterly cold. Here the fresh westerlies forsook us, and we bobbed and blobbed about in doldrummy weather for many days. Mostly it was calm, or light contrary winds, though sometimes a burst of breeze, as like as not from dead ahead, would last for a few hours. In our weakened condition, with so large a boat, it was out of the question to row. We could merely hoard our food and wait for God to show a more kindly face. The 3 of us were very faithful Christians, and we made a practice of prayer each day before the apportionment of food. Yes, and each of us prayed privately, often and long. By the end of January our food was near its end. The pork was entirely gone, and we used the barrel for catching and storing rainwater. Not many pounds of beef remained, and in all the 9 weeks in the open boat we had raised no sail and glimpsed no land. Captain Nicholl frankly admitted that after 63 days of dead reckoning he did not know where we were. The 20th of February saw the last morsel of food eaten. I prefer to skip the details of much that happened in the next 8 days. I shall touch only on the incidents that serve to show what manner of men were my companions. We had starved so long we had no reserves of strength on which to draw when the food utterly ceased, and we grew weaker with great rapidity. On February 24th we calmly talked the situation over. We were 3 stout-spirited men, full of life and toughness, and we did not want to die. No one of us would volunteer to sacrifice himself for the other 2. But we agreed on 3 things. We must have food, we must decide the matter by casting lots, and we would cast the lots next morning if there were no wind. Next morning there was wind, not much of it, but fair, so that we were able to log a sluggish 2 knots on our northerly course. The mornings of the 26th and 27th found us with a similar breeze. We were fearfully weak, but we abided by our decision and continued to sail. But with the morning of the 28th we knew the time was come. The longboat rolled drearily on an empty, windless sea, and the stagnant, overcast sky gave no promise of any breeze. I cut 3 pieces of cloth, all of a size, from my jacket. In the ravel of one of these pieces was a bit of brown thread. Whoever drew this lost. I then put the 3 lots into my hat, covering it with Captain Nicholl's hat. All was ready, but we delayed for a time while each prayed silently and long, for we knew that we were leaving the decision to God. I was not unaware of my own honesty and worth, but I was equally aware of the honesty and worth of my companions, so that it perplexed me how God could decide so fine-balanced and delicate a matter. The captain, as was his right and due, drew first. After his hand was in the hat, he delayed for some time with closed eyes, his lips moving a last prayer, and he drew a blank. This was right, a true decision I could not but admit to myself, for Captain Nicholl's life was largely known to me, and I knew him to be honest, upright, and God-fearing. Remained the surgeon and me. It was one or the other, and according to ship's rating, it was his due to draw next. Again we prayed. As I prayed, I strove to quest back in my life and cast a hurried tally-sheet of my own worth and unworth. I held the hat on my knees with Captain Nicholl's hat over it. The surgeon thrust in his hand and fumbled about for some time, while I wondered whether the feel of that one brown thread could be detected from the rest of the ravel. At last he withdrew his hand. The brown thread was in his piece of cloth. I was instantly very humble and very grateful for God's blessing thus extended to me, and I resolved to keep more faithfully than ever all of his commandments. The next moment I could not help but feel that the surgeon and the captain were pledged to each other by closer ties of position and intercourse than with me, and that they were in a measure disappointed with the outcome. And close with that thought ran the conviction that they were such true men that the outcome would not interfere with the plan arranged. I was right. The surgeon bared arm and knife and prepared to open a great vein. First, however, he spoke a few words. "I am a native of Norfolk in the Virginias," he said, "where I expect I have now a wife and 3 children living. The only favor that I have to request of you is, that should it please God to deliver either of you from your perilous situation, and should you be so fortunate as to reach once more your native country, that you would acquaint my unfortunate family with my wretched fate." Next, he requested courteously of us a few minutes in which to arrange his affairs with God. Neither Captain Nicholl nor I could utter a word, but with streaming eyes we nodded our consent. Without doubt, Arnold Bentham was the best collected of the 3 of us. My own anguish was prodigious, and I am confident that Captain Nicholl suffered equally. But what was one to do? The thing was fair and proper, and had been decided by God. But when Arnold Bentham had completed his last arrangements and made ready to do the act, I could contain myself no longer, and cried out, "Wait! We who have endured so much surely can endure a little more. It is now mid-morning. Let us wait until twilight. Then, if no event has appeared to change our dreadful destiny, do you, Arnold Bentham, do as we have agreed." He looked to Captain Nicholl for confirmation of my suggestion, and Captain Nicholl could only nod. He could utter no word, but in his moist and frosty blue eyes was a wealth of acknowledgment I could not misread. I did not, I could not, deem it a crime, having so determined by fair drawing of lots that Captain Nicholl and myself should profit by the death of Arnold Bentham. I could not believe that the love of life that actuated us had been implanted in our breasts by aught other than God. It was God's will, and we, his poor creatures, could only obey and fulfill his will. And yet God was kind. In his all-kindness he saved us from so terrible, though so righteous, an act. Scarce had quarter of an hour passed, when a fan of air from the west, with a hint of frost and damp in it, crisped on our cheeks. In another 5 minutes we had steerage from the filled sail, and Arnold Bentham was at the steering sweep. "Save what little strength you have," he had said. "Let me consume the little strength left in me in order that it may increase your chance to survive." And so he steered to a freshening breeze, while Captain Nicholl and I lay sprawled in the boat's bottom and in our weakness dreamed dreams and glimpsed visions of the dear things of life far across the world from us. It was an ever-freshening breeze of wind that soon began to puff and gust. The cloud stuff flying across the sky foretold us of a gale. By midday Arnold Bentham fainted at the steering, and ere the boat could broach in the tidy sea already running, Captain Nicholl and I were at the steering sweep with all the four of our weak hands upon it. We came to an agreement, and just as Captain Nicholl had drawn the first lot by virtue of his office, so now he took the first spell at steering. Thereafter the three of us spelled one another every 15 minutes. We were very weak, and we could not spell longer at a time. By mid-afternoon a dangerous sea was running. We should have rounded the boat too, had our situation not been so desperate, and let her drift bow on to a sea anchor extemporized of our mast and sail. Had we broached in those great overtopping seas, the boat would have been rolled over and over. Time and again that afternoon Arnold Bentham, for our sakes, begged that we come to a sea anchor. He knew that we continued to run only in the hope that the decree of the lots might not have to be carried out. He was a noble man. So was Captain Nicholl noble, whose frosty eyes had wizened to points of steel. And in such noble company how could I be less noble? I thanked God repeatedly, through the long afternoon of peril, for the privilege of having known two such men. God and the right dwelt in them, and no matter what my poor fate might be, I could but feel well recompensed by such companionship. Like them I did not want to die, yet was unafraid to die. The quick, early doubt I had had of these two men was long since dissipated. Hard the school and hard the men, but they were noble men, God's own men. I saw it first. Arnold Bentham, his own death accepted, and Captain Nicholl, well nigh accepting death, lay rolling like loose-bodied, deep men in the boat's bottom, and I was steering when I saw it. The boat, foaming and surging with the swiftness of wind in its sail, was uplifted on a crest, when, close before me, I saw the sea-battered islet of rock. It was not half a mile off. I cried out, so that the other two, kneeling and reeling and clutching for support, were peering and staring at what I saw. "Straight for it, Daniel," Captain Nicholl mumbled command. "There may be a cove. There may be a cove. It is our only chance." Once again he spoke, when we were atop that dreadful lee shore with no cove existent. "Straight for it, Daniel. If we go clear, we are too weak ever to win back against sea and wind." He was right. I obeyed. He drew his watch and looked, and I asked the time. It was 5 o'clock. He stretched out his hand to Arnold Bentham, who met and shook it weakly, and both gazed at me, in their eyes extending the same handclasp. It was farewell, I knew, for what chance had creatures so feeble as we to win alive over those surf-battered rocks to the higher rocks beyond? End of chapter 19, part 1. Chapter 19, Part 2, of The Jacket, by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Barry Eads. 20 feet from shore, the boat was snatched out of my control. In a trice it was overturned, and I was strangling in the salt. I never saw my companions again. By good fortune I was buoyed by the steering oar I still grasped, and by great good fortune a fling of sea, at the right instant, at the right spot, threw me far up the far gentle slope of the one shelving rock on all that terrible shore. I was not hurt, I was not bruised, and with brain reeling from weakness I was able to crawl and scramble farther up beyond the clutching backwash of the sea. I stood upright, knowing myself saved, and thanking God, and staggering as I stood. Already the boat was pounded to 1,000 fragments, and though I saw them not, I could guess how grievously had been pounded the bodies of Captain Nicholl and Arnold Bentham. I saw an oar on the edge of the foam, and at certain risk I drew it clear. Then I fell to my knees, knowing myself fainting. And yet, ere I fainted, with a sailor's instinct, I dragged my body on and up among the cruel hurting rocks to faint finally beyond the reach of the sea. I was near a dead man myself that night, mostly in stupor, only dimly aware at times of the extremity of cold and wet that I endured. Morning brought me astonishment and terror. No plant, not a blade of grass, grew on that wretched projection of rock from the ocean's bottom. 1/4 mile in width and 1/2 mile in length, it was no more than a heap of rocks. Naught could I discover to gratify the cravings of exhausted nature. I was consumed with thirst, yet was there no fresh water. In vain I tasted to my mouth's undoing every cavity and depression in the rocks. The spray of the gale so completely had enveloped every portion of the island that every depression was filled with water salt as the sea. Of the boat remained nothing, not even a splinter to show that a boat had been. I stood possessed of my garments, a stout knife, and the one oar I had saved. The gale had abated, and all that day, staggering and falling, crawling till hands and knees bled, I vainly sought water. That night, nearer death than ever, I sheltered behind a rock from the wind. A heavy shower of rain made me miserable. I removed my various coats and spread them to soak up the rain. But when I came to wring the moisture from them into my mouth, I was disappointed, because the cloth had been thoroughly impregnated with the salt of the ocean in which I had been immersed. I lay on my back, my mouth open to catch the few raindrops that fell directly into it. It was tantalizing, but it kept my membranes moist and me from madness. The second day I was a very sick man. I, who had not eaten for so long, began to swell to a monstrous fatness. My legs, my arms, my whole body. With the slightest of pressures my fingers would sink in a full inch into my skin, and the depressions so made were long in going away. Yet did I labor sore in order to fulfill God's will that I should live. Carefully, with my hands, I cleaned out the salt water from every slight hole, in the hope that succeeding showers of rain might fill them with water that I could drink. My sad lot and the memories of the loved ones at Elkton threw me into a melancholy, so that I often lost my recollection for hours at a time. This was a mercy, for it veiled me from my sufferings that else would have killed me. In the night I was roused by the beat of rain, and I crawled from hole to hole, lapping up the rain or licking it from the rocks. Brackish it was, but drinkable. It was what saved me. For toward morning I awoke to find myself in a profuse perspiration and quite free of all delirium. Then came the sun, the first time since my stay on the island, and I spread most of my garments to dry. Of water I drank my careful fill, and I calculated there was 10 days' supply if carefully husbanded. It was amazing how rich I felt with this vast wealth of brackish water, and no great merchant, with all his ships returned from prosperous voyages, his warehouses filled to the rafters, his strong boxes overflowing, could have felt as wealthy as did I when I discovered, cast up on the rocks, the body of a seal that had been dead for many days. Nor did I fail, first, to thank God on my knees for this manifestation of his ever unfailing kindness. The thing was clear to me. God had not intended I should die. From the very first, he had not so intended. I knew the dilapidated state of my stomach, and I ate sparingly in the knowledge that my natural voracity would surely kill me did I yield myself to it. Never had sweeter morsels passed my lips, and I make free to confess that I shed tears of joy again and again at contemplation of that putrefied carcass. My heart of hope beat strong in me once more. Carefully I preserved the portions of the carcass remaining. Carefully I covered my rock cisterns with flat stones, so that the sun's rays might not evaporate the precious fluid, and in precaution against some upspringing of wind in the night and the sudden flying of spray. Also I gathered me tiny fragments of seaweed, and dried them in the sun for an easement between my poor body and the rough rocks whereon I made my lodging. And my garments were dry, the first time in days, so that I slept the heavy sleep of exhaustion and of returning health. When I awoke to a new day I was another man. The absence of the sun did not depress me, and I was swiftly to learn that God, not forgetting me while I slumbered, had prepared other and wonderful blessings for me. I would have fain rubbed my eyes and looked again, for, as far as I could see, the rocks bordering upon the ocean were covered with seals. There were thousands of them, and in the water other thousands disported themselves, while the sound that went up from all their throats was prodigious and deafening. I knew it when I saw it. Meat lay there for the taking, meat sufficient for a score of ships' companies. I directly seized my oar, than which there was no other stick of wood on the island, and cautiously advanced upon all that immensity of provender. It was quickly guessed by me that these creatures of the sea were unacquainted with man. They betrayed no signals of timidity at my approach, and I found it a boy's task to rap them on the head with the oar. And when I had so killed my third and my fourth, I went immediately and strangely mad. Indeed, quite bereft was I of all judgment as I slew and continued to slay. For the space of 2 hours I toiled unceasingly with the oar till I was ready to drop. What excess of slaughter I might have been guilty of I know not, for at the end of that time, as if by a signal, all the seals that still lived threw themselves into the water and swiftly disappeared. I found the number of slain seals to exceed 200. And I was shocked and frightened because of the madness of slaughter that had possessed me. I had sinned by wanton wastefulness, and after I had duly refreshed myself with this good wholesome food, I set about as well as I could to make amends. But first, ere the great task began, I returned thanks to that Being through whose mercy I had been so miraculously preserved. Thereupon I labored until dark, and after dark, skinning the seals, cutting the meat into strips, and placing it upon the tops of the rocks to dry in the sun. Also I found small deposits of salt in the nooks and crannies of the rocks on the weather side of the island. This I rubbed into the meat as a preservative. 4 days I so toiled, and in the end was foolishly proud before God in that no scrap of all that supply of meat had been wasted. The unremitting labor was good for my body, which built up rapidly by means of this wholesome diet in which I did not stint myself. Another evidence of God's mercy. Never in the 8 years I spent on that barren islet was there so long a spell of clear weather and steady sunshine as in the period immediately following the slaughter of the seals. Months were to pass ere ever the seals revisited my island, but in the meantime I was anything but idle. I built me a hut of stone, and adjoining it a storehouse for my cured meat. The hut I roofed with many sealskins, so that it was fairly waterproof, but I could never cease to marvel, when the rain beat on that roof, that no less than a king's ransom in the London fur market protected a castaway sailor from the elements. I was quickly aware of the importance of keeping some kind of reckoning of time, without which I was sensible that I should soon lose all knowledge of the day of the week, and be unable to distinguish one from the other, and not know which was the Lord's day. I remembered back carefully to the reckoning of time kept in the longboat by Captain Nicholl, and carefully, again and again, to make sure beyond any shadow of uncertainty, I went over the tale of the days and nights I had spent on the island. Then, by 7 stones outside my hut, I kept my weekly calendar. In one place on the oar I cut a small notch for each week, and in another place on the oar I notched the months, being duly careful indeed to reckon in the additional days to each month over and beyond the 4 weeks. Thus I was enabled to pay due regard to the Sabbath. As the only mode of worship I could adopt, I carved a short hymn, appropriate to my situation, on the oar, which I never failed to chant on the Sabbath. God, in his all-mercy, had not forgotten me, nor did I, in those 8 years, fail at all proper times to remember God. It was astonishing the work required, under such circumstances, to supply one's simple needs of food and shelter. Indeed, I was rarely idle that first year. The hut itself, a mere lair of rocks, nevertheless took 6 weeks of my time. The tardy curing and the endless scraping of the sealskins, so as to make them soft and pliable for garments, occupied my spare moments for months and months. Then there was the matter of my water supply. After any heavy gale, the flying spray salted my saved rainwater, so that at times I was grievously put to live through till fresh rains fell unaccompanied by high winds. Aware that a continual dropping will wear a stone, I selected a large stone, fine and tight of texture, and by means of smaller stones I proceeded to pound it hollow. In 5 weeks of most arduous toil I managed thus to make a jar which I esteemed to hold 1.5 gallons. Later I similarly made a 4-gallon jar. It took me 9 weeks. Other small ones I also made from time to time. One, that would have contained 8 gallons, developed a flaw when I had worked 7 weeks on it. But it was not until my 4th year on the island, when I had become reconciled to the possibility that I might continue to live there for the term of my natural life, that I created my masterpiece. It took me 8 months, but it was tight, and it held upwards of 30 gallons. These stone vessels were a great gratification to me, so much so that at times I forgot my humility and was unduly vain of them. Truly, they were more elegant to me than was ever the costliest piece of furniture to any queen. Also I made me a small rock vessel, containing no more than a quart, with which to convey water from the catching places to my large receptacles. When I say that this 1-quart vessel weighed all of 2 stone, the reader will realize that the mere gathering of the rainwater was no light task. Thus I rendered my lonely situation as comfortable as could be expected. I had completed me a snug and secure shelter, and as to provision, I had always on hand a 6 months' supply, preserved by salting and drying. For these things, so essential to preserve life, and which one could scarcely have expected to obtain upon a desert island, I was sensible that I could not be too thankful. Although denied the privilege of enjoying the society of any human creature, not even of a dog or a cat, I was far more reconciled to my lot than thousands probably would have been. Upon the desolate spot where fate had placed me, I conceived myself far more happy than many who, for ignominious crimes, were doomed to drag out their lives in solitary confinement, with conscience ever biting as a corrosive canker. However dreary my prospects, I was not without hope that Providence, which, at the very moment when hunger threatened me with dissolution, and when I might easily have been engulfed in the maw of the sea, had cast me upon those barren rocks, would finally direct someone to my relief. If deprived of the society of my fellow creatures and the conveniences of life, I could not but reflect that my forlorn situation was yet attended with some advantages. Of the whole island, though small, I had peaceable possession. No one, it was probable, would ever appear to dispute my claim, unless it were the amphibious animals of the sea. Since the island was almost inaccessible, at night my repose was not disturbed by continual apprehension of the approach of cannibals or of beasts of prey. Again and again I thanked God on my knees for these various and many benefactions. Yet is a man ever a strange and unaccountable creature. I, who had asked of God's mercy no more than putrid meat to eat and a sufficiency of water not too brackish, was no sooner blessed with an abundance of cured meat and sweet water than I began to know discontent with my lot. I began to want fire, and the savour of cooked meat in my mouth. And continually I would discover myself longing for certain delicacies of the palate, such as were part of the common daily fare on the home table at Elkton. Strive as I would, ever my fancy eluded my will and wantoned in daydreaming of the great things I had eaten and of the good things I would eat if ever I were rescued from my lonely situation. It was the old Adam in me, I suppose, the taint of that first father who was the first rebel against God's commandments. Most strange is man, ever insatiable, ever unsatisfied, never at peace with God or himself, his days filled with restlessness and useless endeavor, his nights a glut of vain dreams of desires willful and wrong. Yes, and also I was much annoyed by my craving for tobacco. My sleep was often a torment to me, for it was then that my desires took license to rove, so that 1,000 times I dreamed myself possessed of hogsheads of tobacco, and of warehouses of tobacco, and of shiploads and of entire plantations of tobacco. But I revenged myself upon myself. I prayed God unceasingly for a humble heart, and chastised my flesh with unremitting toil. Unable to improve my mind, I determined to improve my barren island. I labored 4 months at constructing a stone wall 30 feet long, including its wings, and a 12 feet high. This was as a protection to the hut in the periods of the great gales when all the island was as a tiny petrel in the maw of the hurricane. Nor did I conceive the time misspent. Thereafter I lay snug in the heart of calm, while all the air for 100 feet above my head was one stream of gust-driven water. In the 3rd year I began me a pillar of rock. Rather it was a pyramid, 4 square, broad at the base, sloping upward, not steeply to the apex. In this fashion I was compelled to build, for gear and timber there was none in all the island for the construction of scaffolding. Not until the close of the 5th year was my pyramid complete. It stood on the summit of the island. Now, when I state that the summit was but 40 feet above the sea, and that the peak of my pyramid was 40 feet above the summit, it will be conceived that I, without tools, had doubled the stature of the island. It might be urged by some unthinking ones that I interfered with God's plan in the creation of the world. Not so, I hold. For was not I equally a part of God's plan, along with this heap of rocks upjutting in the solitude of ocean? My arms with which to work, my back with which to bend and lift, my hands cunning to clutch and hold, were not these parts too in God's plan? Much I pondered the matter. I know that I was right. In the 6th year I increased the base of my pyramid, so that in 18 months thereafter the height of my monument was 50 feet above the height of the island. This was no Tower of Babel. It served 2 right purposes. It gave me a lookout from which to scan the ocean for ships, and increased the likelihood of my island being sighted by the careless roving eye of any seaman. And it kept my body and mind in health. With hands never idle, there was small opportunity for Satan on that island. Only in my dreams did he torment me, principally with visions of varied foods and with imagined indulgence in the foul weed called tobacco. On the 18th day of the month of June, in the 6th year of my sojourn on that island, I descried a sail. But it passed far to leeward, at too great a distance to discover me. Rather than suffering disappointment, the very appearance of this sail afforded me the liveliest satisfaction. It convinced me of a fact that I had before in a degree doubted, to wit, that these seas were sometimes visited by navigators. Among other things, where the seals hauled up out of the sea, I built wide-spreading wings of low rock walls that narrowed to a cul-de-sac, where I might conveniently kill such seals as entered, without exciting their fellows outside, and without permitting any wounded or frightening seal to escape and spread a contagion of alarm. 7 months to this structure alone were devoted. As the time passed, I grew more content with my lot, and the devil came less and less in my sleep to torment the old Adam in me with lawless visions of tobacco and savory foods. And I continued to eat my seal meat and call it good, and to drink the sweet rainwater of which always I had plenty, and to be grateful to God. And God heard me, I know, for during all my term on that island I never knew a moment of sickness, save 2, both of which were due to my gluttony, as I shall later relate. In the 5th year, ere I had convinced myself that the keels of ships did on occasion plough these seas, I began carving on my oar minutes of the more remarkable incidents that had attended me since I quitted the peaceful shores of America. This I rendered as intelligible and permanent as possible, the letters being of the smallest size. 6 and even 5 letters were often a day's work for me, so painstaking was I. And, lest it should prove my hard fortune never to meet the long-wished opportunity to return to my friends and to my family at Elkton, I engraved, or niched, on the broad end of the oar, the legend of my ill fate, which I have already quoted near the beginning of this narrative. This oar, which had proved so serviceable to me in my destitute situation, and which now contained a record of my own fate and that of my shipmates, I spared no pains to preserve. No longer did I risk it in knocking seals on the head. Instead, I equipped myself with a stone club, some 3 feet in length and of suitable diameter, which occupied an even month in the fashioning. Also, to secure the oar from the weather, for I used it in mild breezes as a flagstaff on top of my pyramid, from which to fly a flag I made me from one of my precious shirts, I contrived for it a covering of well-cured sealskins. In the month of March of the 6th year of my confinement, I experienced one of the most tremendous storms that was perhaps ever witnessed by man. It commenced at about 9 in the evening, with the approach of black clouds and a freshening wind from the southwest, which, by 11, had become a hurricane, attended with incessant peals of thunder and the sharpest lightning I had ever witnessed. I was not without apprehension for the safety of the island. Over every part the seas made a clean breach, except of the summit of my pyramid. There the life was nigh beaten and suffocated out of my body by the drive of the wind and spray. I could not but be sensible that my existence was spared solely because of my diligence in erecting the pyramid and so doubling the stature of the island. Yet in the morning I had great reason for thankfulness. All my saved rainwater was turned brackish, save that in my largest vessel, which was sheltered in the lee of the pyramid. By careful economy, I knew I had drink sufficient until the next rain, no matter how delayed, should fall. My hut was quite washed out by the seas, and of my great store of seal meat only a wretched, pulpy modicum remained. Nevertheless, I was agreeably surprised to find the rocks plentifully distributed with a sort of fish more nearly like the mullet than any I had ever observed. Of these I picked up no less than 1,219, which I split and cured in the sun after the manner of cod. This welcome change of diet was not without its consequence. I was guilty of gluttony, and for all the succeeding night I was near to death's door. In the 7th year of my stay on the island, in the very same month of March, occurred a similar storm of great violence. Following upon it, to my astonishment, I found an enormous dead whale, quite fresh, which had been cast up high and dry by the waves. Conceive my gratification when in the bowels of the great fish I found deeply embedded a harpoon of the common sort with a few fathoms of new line attached thereto. Thus were my hopes again revived that I should finally meet with an opportunity to quit the desolate island. Beyond doubt, these seas were frequented by whalemen, and, so long as I kept up a stout heart, sooner or later I should be saved. For 7 years I had lived on seal meat, so that at sight of the enormous plenitude of different and succulent food I fell a victim to my weakness, and ate of such quantities that once again I was well nigh to dying. And yet, after all, this, and the affair of the small fish, were mere indispositions due to the foreignness of the food to my stomach, which had learned to prosper on seal meat and on nothing but seal meat. Of that one whale I preserved a full year's supply of provision. Also, under the sun's rays, in the rock hollows, I tried out much of the oil, which, with the addition of salt, was a welcome thing in which to dip my strips of seal meat whilst dining. Out of my precious rags of shirts I could even have contrived a wick, so that, with the harpoon for steel and rock for flint, I might have had a light at night. But it was a vain thing, and I speedily forewent the thought of it. I had no need for light when God's darkness descended, for I had schooled myself to sleep from sundown to sunrise, winter and summer. I, Darrell Standing, cannot refrain from breaking in on this recital of an earlier existence in order to note a conclusion of my own. Since human personality is a growth, a sum of all previous existences added together, what possibility was there for Warden Atherton to break down my spirit in the inquisition of solitary? I am life that survived a structure builded up through the ages of the past, and such a past. What were 10 days and nights in the jacket to me? To me, who had once been Daniel Foss, and for 8 years learned patience in that school of rocks in the far South Ocean. At the end of my 8th year on the island in the month of September, when I had just sketched most ambitious plans to raise my pyramid to 60 feet above the summit of the island, I awoke one morning to stare out upon a ship with topsails aback and nearly within hail. That I might be discovered, I swung my oar in the air, jumped from rock to rock, and was guilty of all manner of livelinesses of action, until I could see the officers on the quarter-deck looking at me through their spyglasses. They answered by pointing to the extreme westerly end of the island, whither I hastened and discovered their boat manned by half a dozen men. It seems, as I was to learn afterward, the ship had been attracted by my pyramid and had altered its course to make closer examination of so strange a structure that was greater of height than the wild island on which it stood. But the surf proved to be too great to permit the boat to land on my inhospitable shore. After divers unsuccessful attempts, they signaled me that they must return to the ship. Conceive my despair at thus being unable to quit the desolate island. I seized my oar, which I had long since determined to present to the Philadelphia Museum if ever I were preserved, and with it plunged headlong into the foaming surf. Such was my good fortune and my strength and agility that I gained the boat. I cannot refrain from telling here a curious incident. The ship had by this time drifted so far away that we were all of an hour getting aboard. During this time I yielded to my propensities that had been baffled for 8 long years, and begged of the second mate, who steered, a piece of tobacco to chew. This granted, the second mate also proffered me his pipe, filled with prime Virginia leaf. Scarce had 10 minutes passed when I was taken violently sick. The reason for this was clear. My system was entirely purged of tobacco, and what I now suffered was tobacco poisoning such as afflicts any boy at the time of his first smoke. Again I had reason to be grateful to God, and from that day to the day of my death I neither used nor desired the foul weed. I, Darrell Standing, must now complete the amazingness of the details of this existence which I relived while unconscious in the straitjacket in San Quentin Prison. I often wondered if Daniel Foss had been true in his resolve and deposited the carved ore in the Philadelphia Museum. It is a difficult matter for a prisoner in solitary to communicate with the outside world. Once with a guard, and once with a short timer in solitary, I entrusted, by memorization, a letter of inquiry addressed to the curator of the museum. Although under the most solemn pledges, both these men failed me. It was not until after Ed Morrell, by a strange whirl of fate, was released from solitary and appointed head trustee of the entire prison, that I was able to have the letter sent. And now I give the reply, sent me by the curator of the Philadelphia Museum, and smuggled to me by Ed Morrell. It is true, there is such an ore here as you have described, but few persons can know of it, for it is not on exhibition in the public rooms. In fact, and I have held this position for 18 years, I was unaware of its existence myself. But upon consulting our old records, I found that such an ore had been presented by one Daniel Foss of Elkton, Maryland, in the year 1821. Not until after a long search did we find the ore in a disused attic lumber room of odds and ends. The notches and the legend are carved on the ore just as you have described. We have also on file a pamphlet presented at the same time, written by the said Daniel Foss, and published in Britain by the firm of N. Coverley, Jr. in the year 1834. This pamphlet describes 8 years of a castaway's life on a desert island. It is evident that this mariner, in his old age and in want, hawked this pamphlet about among the charitable. I am very curious to learn how you became aware of this ore, of the existence of which we of the museum were ignorant. Am I correct in assuming that you have read an account of some diary published later by this Daniel Foss? I shall be glad for any information on the subject, and am proceeding at once to have the ore and the pamphlet put back on exhibition. Very truly yours, Hosea Salisbury. Footnote: Since the execution of Professor Darrell Standing, at which time the manuscript of his memoirs came into our hands, we have written to Mr. Hosea Salisbury, curator of the Philadelphia Museum, and in reply have received confirmation of the existence of the ore and the pamphlet. The Editor. End footnote. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Jacket by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Barry Eads. Chapter 20. The time came when I humbled Warden Atherton to unconditional surrender, making a vain and empty mouthing of his ultimatum, dynamite or curtains. He gave me up as one who could not be killed in a straitjacket. He had had men die after several hours in the jacket. He had had men die after several days in the jacket, although invariably they were unlaced and carted into hospital ere they breathed their last, and received a death certificate from the doctor of pneumonia, of Bright's disease, or valvular disease of the heart. But me, Warden Atherton, could never kill. Never did the urgency arise of carting my maltreated and perishing carcass to the hospital. Yet I will say that Warden Atherton tried his best and dared his worst. There was the time when he double-jacketed me. It was so rich an incident that I must tell it. It happened that one of the San Francisco newspapers, seeking, as every newspaper and as every commercial enterprise seeks, a market that will enable it to realize a profit, tried to interest the radical portion of the working class in prison reform. As a result, Union labor possessing an important political significance at the time-serving politicians at Sacramento appointed a senatorial committee of investigation of the state prisons. This state Senate committee investigated, pardon my italicized sneer, San Quentin. Never was there so model an institution of detention. The convicts themselves so testified, nor can one blame them. They had experienced similar investigations in the past. They knew on which side their bread was buttered. They knew that all their sides and most of their ribs would ache very quickly after the taking of their testimony, if said testimony were adverse to the prison administration. Oh, believe me, my reader, it is a very ancient story. It was ancient in old Babylon, many 1,000 years ago, as I well remember of that old time when I rotted in prison while palace intrigues shook the court. As I have said, every convict testified to the humaneness of Warden Atherton's administration. In fact, so touching were their testimonials to the kindness of the warden, to the good and varied quality of the food and the cooking, to the gentleness of the guards, and to the general decency and ease and comfort of the prison domicile, that the opposition newspapers of San Francisco raised an indignant cry for more rigor in the management of our prisons, in that, otherwise, honest but lazy citizens would be seduced into seeking enrollment as prison guests. The Senate committee even invaded solitary, where the three of us had little to lose and nothing to gain. Jake Oppenheimer spat in its faces and told its members, all and sundry, to go to hell. Ed Morrell told them what a noisome stews the place was, insulted the warden to his face, and was recommended by the committee to be given a taste of the antiquated and obsolete punishments that, after all, must have been devised by previous wardens out of necessity for the right handling of hard characters like him. I was careful not to insult the warden. I testified craftily, and as a scientist, beginning with small beginnings, making an art of my exposition, step by step, by tiny steps, inveiling my senatorial auditors on into willingness and eagerness to listen to the next exposure, the whole fabric so woven that there was no natural halting place at which to drop a period or interpolate a query. In this fashion, thus, I got my whole tale across. Alas! No whisper of what I divulged ever went outside the prison walls. The Senate committee gave a beautiful whitewash to Warden Atherton and San Quentin. The crusading San Francisco newspaper assured its working-class readers that San Quentin was whiter than snow, and further, that while it was true that the straitjacket was still a recognized legal method of punishment for the refractory, that nevertheless, at the present time, under the present humane and spiritually right-minded warden, the straitjacket was never, under any circumstance, used. And while the poor asses of laborers read and believed, while the Senate committee dined and wined with the warden at the expense of the state and the taxpayer, Ed Morrell, Jake Oppenheimer, and I were lying in our jackets, laced just a trifle more tightly and more vindictively than we had ever been laced before. "It is to laugh," Ed Morrell tapped to me with the edge of the sole of his shoe. "I should worry," tapped Jake. But as for me, I too capped my bitter scorn and laughter, remembered the prison houses of old Babylon, smiled to myself a huge cosmic smile, and drifted off and away into the largeness of the little death that made me heir of all the ages and the rider full panoplied and astride of time. Yea, dear brother of the outside world, while the whitewash was running off the press, while the august senators were whining and dining, we three of the living dead, buried alive in solidarity, were sweating our pain in the canvas torture. And after the dinner, warm with wine, Warden Atherton himself came to see how fared it with us. Me, as usual, they found in coma. Dr. Jackson for the first time must have been alarmed. I was brought back across the dark to consciousness with the bite of ammonia in my nostrils. I smiled into the faces bent over me. "Shamming," snorted the warden, and I knew by the flush on his face and the thickness in his tongue that he had been drinking. I licked my lips as a sign for water, for I desired to speak. "You are an ass," I at last managed to say with cold distinctness. "You are an ass, a coward, a cur, a pitiful thing so low that spittle would be wasted on your face. In such manner Jake Oppenheimer is over-generous with you. As for me, without shame I tell you the only reason I do not spit upon you is that I cannot demean myself nor so degrade my spittle." "I've reached the limit of my patience," he bellowed. "I will kill you, Standing." "You've been drinking," I retorted, "and I would advise you, if you must say such things, not to take so many of your prison curs into your confidence. They will snitch on you some day, and you will lose your job." But the wine was up and master of him. "Put another jacket on him," he commanded. "You are a dead man, Standing, but you'll not die in the jacket. We'll bury you from the hospital." This time, over the precious jacket, the second jacket was put on from behind and laced up in front. "Lord, Lord, Warden, it is bitter weather," I sneered. "The frost is sharp. Wherefore I am indeed grateful for you giving me 2 jackets. I shall be almost comfortable." "Tighter," he urged to Al Hutchins, who was drawing the lacing. "Throw your feet into the skunk. Break his ribs." I must admit that Hutchins did his best. "You will lie about me," the warden raved, the flush of wine and wrath flooding ruddier into his face. "Now see what you get for it. Your number is taken at last, Standing. This is your finish. Do you hear? This is your finish." "A favor, Warden," I whispered faintly. Faint I was. Perforce I was nearly unconscious from the fearful constriction. "Make it a triple jacketing," I managed to continue, while the cell walls swayed and reeled about me, and while I fought with all my will to hold my consciousness that was being squeezed out of me by the jackets. "Another jacket, Warden. It will be so much, warmer." And my whisper faded away as I ebbed down into the little death. I was never the same man after that double jacketing. Never again, to this day, no matter what my food, was I properly nurtured. I suffered internal injuries to an extent I never cared to investigate. The old pain in my ribs and stomach is with me now as I write these lines, but the poor, maltreated machinery has served its purpose. It has enabled me to live thus far, and it will enable me to live the little longer to the day they take me out in the shirt without a collar and stretch my neck with the well-stretched rope. But the double jacketing was the last straw. It broke down Warden Atherton. He surrendered to the demonstration that I was unkillable. As I told him once, "The only way you can get me, Warden, is to sneak in here some night with a hatchet." Jake Oppenheimer was responsible for a good one on the Warden which I must relate. "I say, Warden, it must be straight hell for you to have to wake up every morning with yourself on your pillow." And Ed Morrell to the Warden, "Your mother must have been damn fond of children to have raised you." It was really an offense to me when the jacketing ceased. I sadly missed that dream world of mine. But not for long. I found that I could suspend animation by the exercise of my will, aided mechanically by constricting my chest and abdomen with the blanket. Thus I induced physiological and psychological states similar to those caused by the jacket. So, at will, and without the old torment, I was free to roam through time. Ed Morrell believed all my adventures, but Jake Oppenheimer remained skeptical to the last. It was during my 3rd year in solitary that I paid Oppenheimer a visit. I was never able to do it but that once, and that one time was wholly unplanned and unexpected. It was merely after unconsciousness had come to me that I found myself in his cell. My body, I knew, lay in the jacket back in my own cell. Although never before had I seen him, I knew that this man was Jake Oppenheimer. It was summer weather, and he lay without clothes on top his blanket. I was shocked by his cadaverous face and skeleton-like body. He was not even the shell of a man. He was merely the structure of a man, the bones of a man, still cohering, stripped practically of all flesh and covered with a parchment-like skin. Not until back in my own cell and consciousness was I able to mull the thing over and realize that just as was Jake Oppenheimer, so was Ed Morrell, so was I. I could not but thrill as I glimpsed the vastitude of spirit that inhabited these frail, perishing carcasses of us, the three incorrigibles of solitary. Flesh is a cheap, vain thing. Grass is flesh, and flesh becomes grass, but the spirit is the thing that abides and survives. I have no patience with these flesh-worshippers. A taste of solitary in San Quentin would swiftly convert them to a due appreciation and worship of the spirit. But to return to my experience in Oppenheimer's cell. His body was that of a man long dead and shriveled by desert heat. The skin that covered it was of the color of dry mud. His sharp, yellow-gray eyes seemed the only part of him that was alive. They were never at rest. He lay on his back, and the eyes darted hither and thither, following the flight of the several flies that disported in the gloomy air above him. I noted, too, a scar just above his right elbow, and another scar on his right ankle. After a time he yawned, rolled over on his side, and inspected an angry-looking sore just above his hip. This he proceeded to cleanse and dress by the crude methods men in solitary must employ. I recognized the sore as one of the sort caused by the straitjacket. On my body, at this moment of writing, are hundreds of scars of the jacket. Next, Oppenheimer rolled on his back, gingerly took one of his front upper teeth, an eye-tooth, between thumb and forefinger, and consideratively moved it back and forth. Again he yawned, stretched his arms, rolled over, and knocked the call to Ed Morrell. I read the code as a matter of course. "Thought you might be awake," Oppenheimer tapped. "How goes it with the professor?" Then, dim and far, I could hear Morrell's taps enunciated that they had put me in the jacket an hour before, and that, as usual, I was already deaf to all knuckle-talk. "He is a good guy," Oppenheimer rapped on. "I always was suspicious of educated mugs, but he ain't been hurt none by his education. He is sure square. Got all the spunk in the world, and you could not get him to squeal or double-cross in a million years." To all of which, and with amplification, Ed Morrell agreed. And I must right here, ere I go a word further, say that I have lived many years and many lives, and that in those many lives I have known proud moments, but that the proudest moment I have ever known was the moment when my two comrades in solitary passed this appraisal of me. Ed Morrell and Jake Oppenheimer were great spirits, and in all time no greater honor was ever accorded me than this admission of me to their comradeship. Kings have knighted me, emperors have ennobled me, and as king myself I have known stately moments. Yet of it all nothing do I adjudge so splendid as this allecade delivered by two lifers in solitary, deemed by the world as the very bottommost of the human cesspool. Afterwards, recuperating from this particular bout with the jacket, I brought up my visit to Jake's cell as a proof that my spirit did leave my body. But Jake was unshakable. "It is guessing that is more than guessing," was his reply, when I had described to him his successive particular actions at the time my spirit had been in his cell. "It is figuring. You have been close to 3 years in solitary yourself, Professor, and you can come pretty near to figuring what any guy will do to be killing time. There ain't a thing you told me that you and Ed ain't done thousands of times, from lying with your clothes off in hot weather to watching flies, tending sores, and rapping." Morrell sided with me, but it was no use. "Now, don't take it hard, Professor," Jake tapped. "I ain't saying you lied. I just say you get to dreaming and figuring in the jacket without knowing you're doing it. I know you believe what you say, and that you think it happened, but it don't buy nothing with me. You figure it, but you don't know you figure it. That is something you know all the time, though you don't know you know it until you get into them dreamy, woozy states." "Hold on, Jake," I tapped. "You know I have never seen you with my own eyes. Is that right?" "I got to take your word for it, Professor. You might have seen me and not known it was me. The point is," I continued, "not having seen you with your clothes off, nevertheless I am able to tell you about that scar above your right elbow and that scar on your right ankle." "Oh, shucks," was his reply. "You'll find all that in my prison description and along with my mug in the rogues' gallery. There is thousands of chiefs of police and detectives know all that stuff." "I never heard of it," I assured him. "You don't remember that you ever heard of it," he corrected, "but you must have just the same. Though you have forgotten about it, the information is in your brain all right, stored away for reference, only you forgot where it is stored. You've got to get woozy in order to remember. Did you ever forget a man's name you used to know as well as your own brother's? I have. There was a little juror that convicted me in Oakland the time I got handed my 50 years, and one day I found I'd forgotten his name. Why, Bo, I lay here for weeks puzzling for it. Now, just because I could not dig it out of my memory box was no sign it was not there. It was mislaid, that was all. And to prove it, one day when I was not even thinking about it, it popped right out of my brain to the tip of my tongue. "Stacy," I said right out loud. "Joseph Stacy. That was it. Get my drive? You only tell me about them scars what thousands of men know. I don't know how you got the information. I guess you don't know yourself. That ain't my lookout. But there she is. Telling me what many knows buys nothing with me. You got to deliver a whole lot more than that to make me swallow the rest of your whoppers." Hamilton's law of parsimony in the weighing of evidence. So intrinsically was this slum-bred convict a scientist that he had worked out Hamilton's law and rigidly applied it. And yet, and the incident is delicious, Jake Oppenheimer was intellectually honest. That night, as I was dozing off, he called me with the customary signal. "Say, Professor, you said you saw me wiggling my loose tooth. That has got my goat. That is the one thing I can't figure out any way you could know. It only went loose 3 days ago, and I ain't whispered it to a soul." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21, Part 1, of The Jacket, by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Barry Eads. Pascal somewhere says, "In viewing the march of human evolution, the philosophic mind should look upon humanity as one man, and not as a conglomeration of individuals." I sit here in Murderer's Row in Folsom, the drowsy hum of flies in my ears as I ponder that thought of Pascal. It is true. Just as the human embryo, in its brief 10 lunar months, with bewildering swiftness, in myriad forms and semblances a myriad times multiplied, rehearses the entire history of organic life from vegetable to man. Just as the human boy, in his brief years of boyhood, rehearses the history of primitive man in acts of cruelty and savagery, from wantonness of inflicting pain on lesser creatures to tribal consciousness expressed by the desire to run in gangs, just so, I, Darrell Standing, have rehearsed and relived all that primitive man was and did and became until he became even you and me and the rest of our kind in a 20th century civilization. Truly do we carry in us, each human of us alive on the planet today, the incorruptible history of life from life's beginning. This history is written in our tissues and our bones, in our functions and organs, in our brain cells and in our spirits, and in all sorts of physical and psychic atavistic urgencies and compulsions. Once we were fish-like, you and I, my reader, and crawled up out of the sea to pioneer in the great dry land adventure in the thick of which we are now. The marks of the sea are still on us, as the marks of the serpent are still on us, ere the serpent became serpent and we became we, when pre-serpent and pre-we were one. Once we flew in the air, and once we dwelt arboreally and were afraid of the dark. The vestiges remain, graven on you and me, and graven on our seed to come after us to the end of our time on earth. What Pascal glimpsed with the vision of a seer, I have lived. I have seen myself that one man contemplated by Pascal's philosophic eye. Oh, I have a tale, most true, most wonderful, most real to me, although I doubt that I have wit to tell it, and that you, my reader, have wit to perceive it when told. I say that I have seen myself that one man hinted at by Pascal. I have lain in the long trances of the jacket and glimpsed myself 1,000 living men living the 1,000 lives that are themselves the history of the human man climbing upward through the ages. Ah, what royal memories are mine, as I flutter through the eons of the long ago. In single-jacket trances I have lived the many lives involved in the 1,000-years-long odysseys of the early drifts of men. Heavens! Before I was of the flaxen-haired Aesir, who dwelt in Asgard, and before I was of the red-haired Vanir, who dwelt in Vanaheim, long before those times I have memories, living memories, of earlier drifts, when like thistledown before the breeze, we drifted south before the face of the descending polar ice cap. I have died of frost and famine, fight and flood. I have picked berries on the bleak backbone of the world, and I have dug roots to eat from the fat soiled fens and meadows. I have scratched the reindeer's semblance and the semblance of the hairy mammoth on ivory tusks gotten of the chase, and on the rock walls of cave shelters when the winter storms moaned outside. I have cracked marrow bones on the sites of kingly cities that had perished centuries before my time, or that were destined to be builded centuries after my passing. And I have left the bones of my transient carcasses in pond bottoms and glacial gravels and asphaltum lakes. I have lived through the ages known today among the scientists as the Paleolithic, and the Neolithic, and the Bronze. I remember when with our domesticated wolves we herded our reindeer to pasture on the north shore of the Mediterranean, where now are France and Italy and Spain. This was before the ice sheet melted backward toward the pole. Many processions of the equinoxes have I lived through and died in, my reader, only that I remember and you do not. I have been a son of the plough, a son of the fish, a son of the tree. All the religions from the beginnings of man's religious time abide in me, and when the Dominie in the chapel, here in Folsom of a Sunday, worships God in his own good modern way, I know that in him, the Dominie, still abide the worships of the plough, the fish, the tree, aye, and also all worships of Astarte and the night. I have been an Aryan master in old Egypt, when my soldiers scrawled obscenities on the carven tombs of kings dead and gone and forgotten aforetime. And I, the Aryan master in old Egypt, have myself builded my 2 burial places, the one a false and mighty pyramid to which a generation of slaves could attest, the other humble, meager, secret, rock-hewn in a desert valley by slaves who died immediately their work was done. And I wonder me here in Folsom, while democracy dreams its enchantments o'er the 20th century world, whether there, in the rock-hewn crypt of that secret desert valley, the bones still abide that once were mine and that stiffened my animated body when I was an Aryan master high-stomached to command. And on the great drift, southward and eastward under the burning sun that perished all descendants of the houses of Asgard and Vanaheim, I have been a king in Ceylon, a builder of Aryan monuments under Aryan kings in old Java and old Sumatra. And I have died 100 deaths on the great South Sea drift ere ever the rebirth of me came to plant monuments that only Aryans plant on volcanic tropic islands that I, Darrell Standing, cannot name, being too little versed today in that far sea geography. If only I were articulate to paint in the frail medium of words what I see and know and possess incorporated in my consciousness of the mighty driftage of the races in the times before our present written history began. Yes, we had our history even then. Our old men, our priests, our wise ones, told our history into tales and wrote those tales in the stars so that our seed after us should not forget. From the sky came the life-giving rain and the sunlight, and we studied the sky, learned from the stars to calculate time and apportion the seasons, and we named the stars after our heroes and our foods and our devices for getting food, and after our wanderings and drifts and adventures, and after our functions and our furies of impulse and desire. And alas, we thought the heavens unchanging on which we wrote all our humble yearnings and all the humble things we did or dreamed of doing. When I was a son of the bull, I remember me a lifetime I spent at stargazing. And, later and earlier, there were other lives in which I sang with the priests and the bards the taboo songs of the stars, wherein we believed was written our imperishable record. And here, at the end of it all, I pore over books of astronomy from the prison library, such as they allow condemned men to read, and learn that even the heavens are passing fluxes, vexed with star driftage as the earth is by the drifts of men. Equipped with this modern knowledge, I have, returning through the little depth from my earlier lives, been able to compare the heavens then and now. And the stars do change. I have seen pole stars and dynasties of pole stars. The pole star today is in Ursa Minor. Yet in those far days I have seen the pole star in Draco, in Hercules, in Vega, in Cygnus, and in Cepheus. No, not even the stars abide. And yet the memory and the knowledge of them abides in me, in the spirit of me that is memory and that is eternal. Only spirit abides. All else, being mere matter, passes and must pass. Oh, I do see myself today that one man who appeared in the elder world, blond, ferocious, a killer and a lover, a meat-eater and a root-digger, a gypsy and a robber, who, club in hand, through millenniums of years, wandered the world around seeking meat to devour and sheltered nests for his younglings and sucklings. I am that man, the sum of him, the all of him, the hairless biped who struggled upward from the slime and created love and law out of the anarchy of fecund life that screamed and squalled in the jungle. I am all that that man was and did become. I see myself, through the painful generations, snarling and killing the game and the fish, clearing the first fields from the forest, making rude tools of stone and bone, building houses of wood, thatching the roofs with leaves and straw, domesticating the wild grasses and meadow roots, fathering them to become the progenitors of rice and millet and wheat and barley, and all manner of succulent edibles, learning to scratch the soil, to sow, to reap, to store, beating out the fibers of plants to spin into thread and to weave into cloth, devising systems of irrigation, working in metals, making markets and trade routes, building boats and founding navigation. Aye, and organizing village life, welding villages to villages till they became tribes, welding tribes together till they became nations, ever seeking the law of things, ever making the laws of humans so that humans might live together in amity, and by united effort beat down and destroy all manner of creeping, crawling, squalling things that might else destroy them. I was that man in all his births and endeavors. I am that man today, waiting my due death by the law that I helped to devise many 1,000 years ago, and by which I have died many times before this, many times. And as I contemplate this vast past history of me, I find several great and splendid influences, and chiefest of these, the love of woman, man's love for the woman of his kind. I see myself, the one man, the lover, always the lover. Yes, also was I the great fighter, but somehow it seems to me as I sit here and evenly balance it all, that I was, more than aught else, the great lover. It was because I loved greatly that I was the great fighter. Sometimes I think that the story of man is the story of the love of woman. This memory of all my past that I write now is the memory of my love of woman. Even in the 10,000 lives and guises, I loved her. I love her now. My sleep is fraught with her. My waking fancies, no matter whence they start, lead me always to her. There is no escaping her. That eternal, splendid, ever-resplendent figure of woman. Oh, make no mistake. I am no callow, ardent youth. I am an elderly man, broken in health and body and soon to die. I am a scientist and a philosopher. I, as all the generations of philosophers before me, know woman for what she is, her weaknesses and meannesses and immodesties and ignobilities, her earth-bound feet and her eyes that have never seen the stars. But, and the everlasting, irrefragable fact remains, her feet are beautiful, her eyes are beautiful, her arms and breasts are paradise. Her charm is potent beyond all charm that has ever dazzled men. And, as the pole willy-nilly draws the needle, just so, willy-nilly, does she draw men. Woman has made me laugh at death and distance, scorn fatigue and sleep. I have slain men, many men, for love of woman, and in warm blood have baptized our nuptials or washed away the stain of her favor to another. I have gone down to death and dishonor, my betrayal of my comrades and of the stars black upon me, for woman's sake. For my sake, rather, I desired her so. And I have lain in the barley, sick with yearning for her, just to see her pass and glut my eyes with the swaying wonder of her, and of her hair, black with the night, or brown or flaxen, or all gold dusty with the sun. For woman is beautiful to man. She is sweet to his tongue and fragrance in his nostrils. She is fire in his blood, and a thunder of trumpets. Her voice is beyond all music in his ears, and she can shake his soul that else stands steadfast in the draughty presence of the Titans of the light and of the dark. And beyond his star-gazing in his far-imagined heavens, Valkyrie or Huri, man has fain made place for he could see no heaven without her. And the sword, in battle, sings not so sweet a song as the woman sings to man merely by her laugh in the moonlight, or her love-sob in the dark, or by her swaying on her way under the sun while he lies dizzy with longing in the grass. I have died of love. I have died for love, as you shall see. In a little while they will take me out, me, Darrell Standing, and make me die. And that death shall be for love. Oh, not lightly was I stirred when I slew Professor Haskell in the laboratory at the University of California. He was a man, I was a man, and there was a woman beautiful. Do you understand? She was a woman and I was a man and a lover, and all the heredity of love was mine up from the black and squalling jungle ere love was love and man was man. Oh, it is nothing new. Often in that long past have I given life and honor, place and power for love. Man is different from woman. She is close to the immediate and knows only the need of instant things. We know honor above her honor, and pride beyond her wildest guess of pride. Our eyes are far-visioned for star-gazing, while her eyes see no farther than the solid earth beneath her feet, the lover's breast upon her breast, the infant lusty in the hollow of her arm. And yet, such is our alchemy compounded of the ages. Woman works magic in our dreams and in our veins, so that more than dreams and far visions and the blood of life itself is woman to us, who, as lovers truly say, is more than all the world. Yet is this just. Else would man not be man, the fighter and the conqueror, treading his red way on the face of all other and lesser life. For had man not been the lover, the royal lover, he could never have become the kingly fighter. We fight best, and die best, and live best, for what we love. I am that one man. I see myself the many selves that have gone into the constituting of me. And ever I see the woman, the many women, who have made me and undone me, who have loved me and whom I have loved. I remember, long ago when humankind was very young, that I made me a snare and a pit with a pointed stake upthrust in the middle thereof for the taking of Saber-Tooth. Saber-Tooth, long-fanged and long-haired, was the chiefest peril to us of the squatting place, who crouched through the nights over our fires, and by day increased the growing shell-bank beneath us by the clams we dug and devoured from the salt mud flats beside us. And when the roar and the squall of Saber-Tooth roused us where we squatted by our dying embers, and I was wild with far vision of the proof of the pit and the stake, it was the woman, arms about me, leg twining, who fought with me and restrained me not to go out through the dark to my desire. She was part clad, for warmth only, in skins of animals, mangy and fire-burnt, that I had slain. She was swart and dirty with camp smoke, unwashed since the spring rains, with nails gnarled and broken, and hands that were calloused like footpads, and were more like claws than like hands. But her eyes were blue as the summer sky is, as the deep sea is, and there was that in her eyes, and in her clasped arms about me, and in her heart beating against mine, that withheld me. Though through the dark until dawn, while Saber-Tooth squalled his wrath and his agony, I could hear my comrades snickering and sniggling to their women, in that I had not the faith in my emprise and invention to venture through the night to the pit and the stake I had devised for the undoing of Saber-Tooth. But my woman, my savage mate held me, savage that I was, and her eyes drew me, and her arms chained me, and her twining legs and heart beating to mine seduced me from my far dream of things, my man's achievement, the goal beyond goals, the taking and the slaying of Saber-Tooth on the stake in the pit. Once I was Ushu, the archer. I remember it well, for I was lost from my own people, through the great forest, till I emerged on the flatlands and grasslands and was taken in by a strange people, kin in that their skin was white, their hair yellow, their speech not too remote from mine. And she was Igar, and I drew her as I sang in the twilight, for she was destined a race-mother, and she was broad-built and full-dugged, and she could not but draw to the man heavy-muscled, deep-chested, who sang of his prowess in man-slaying and in meat-getting, and so promised food and protection to her in her weakness, whilst she mothered the seed that was to hunt the meat and live after her. And these people knew not the wisdom of my people, and that they snared and pitted their meat, and in battle used clubs and stone-throwing sticks, and were unaware of the virtues of arrows swift flying, notched on the end to fit the thong of deer sinew, well twisted, that sprang into straightness when released to the spring of the ash-stick bent in the middle. And while I sang, the stranger men laughed in the twilight. And only she, Igar, believed and had faith in me. I took her alone to the hunting, where the deer sought the water-hole, and my bow twanged and sang in the covert, and the deer fell fast-stricken, and the warm meat was sweet to us, and she was mine there by the water-hole. And because of Igar I remained with the strange men, and I taught them the making of bows from the red and sweet-smelling wood like unto cedar. And I taught them to keep both eyes open, and to aim with the left eye, and to make blunt shafts for small game, and pronged shafts of bone for the fish in the clear water, and to flake arrowheads from obsidian for the deer and the wild horse, the elk and old Saber-Tooth. But the flaking of stone they laughed at, till I shot an elk through and through, the flaked stone standing out and beyond, the feathered shaft sunk in its vitals, the whole tribe applauding. I was Ushu the archer, and Igar was my woman and mate. We laughed under the sun in the morning, when our man-child and woman-child, yellowed like honey-bees, sprawled and rolled in the mustard, and at night she lay close in my arms, and loved me, and urged me, because of my skill at the seasoning of woods and the flaking of arrowheads, that I should stay close by the camp and let the other men bring to me the meat from the perils of hunting. And I listened, and grew fat and short-breathed, and in the long nights unsleeping, worried that the men of the stranger tribe brought me meat for my wisdom and honor, but laughed at my fatness and undesire for the hunting and fighting. And in my old age, when our sons were man-grown and our daughters were mothers, when up from the southland the dark men, flat-browed, kinky-headed, surged like waves of the sea upon us, and we fled back before them to the hill-slopes, Igar, like my mates far before and long after, leg-twining, arm-clasping, unseen far visions, strove to hold me aloof from the battle. And I tore myself from her, fat and short-breathed, while she wept that no longer I loved her, and I went out to the night fighting and dawn fighting, where, to the singing of bowstrings and the shrilling of arrows, feathered, sharp-pointed, we showed them, the kinky-heads, the skill of the killing, and taught them the wit and the willing of slaughter. And as I died there, at the end of the fighting, there were death songs and singing about me, and the songs seemed to sing, as these words I have written, when I was Ushu the archer, and Igar, my mate-woman, leg-twining, arm-clasping, would have held me back from the battle. Once, and heaven alone knows when, save that it was in the long ago when man was young, we lived beside great swamps, where the hills drew down close to the wide, sluggish river, and where our women gathered berries and roots, and there were herds of deer, of wild horses, of antelope, and of elk, that we men slew with arrows or trapped in the pits or hill pockets. From the river we caught fish in nets, twisted by the women of the bark of young trees. I was a man, eager and curious as the antelope when we lured it by waving grass clumps where we lay hidden in the thick of the grass. The wild rice grew in the swamp, rising sheer from the water on the edges of the channels. Each morning the blackbirds awoke us with their chatter as they left their roost to fly to the swamp, and through the long twilight the air was filled with their noise as they went back to their roosts. It was the time that the rice ripened, and there were ducks also, and ducks and blackbirds feasted to fatness on the ripe rice half unhusked by the sun. End of chapter 21, part 1. Chapter 21, part 2 of The Jacket by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Barry Eads. Being a man, ever restless, ever questing, wondering always what lay beyond the hills and beyond the swamps and in the mud at the river's bottom, I watched the wild ducks and blackbirds and pondered till my pondering gave me vision and I saw. And this is what I saw, the reasoning of it. Meat was good to eat. In the end, tracing it back, or at the first, rather, all meat came from grass. The meat of the duck and of the blackbird came from the seed of the swamp rice. To kill a duck with an arrow scarce paid for the labor of stalking and the long hours in hiding. The blackbirds were too small for arrow killing save by the boys who were learning and preparing for the taking of larger game. And yet, in rice season, blackbirds and ducks were succulently fat. Their fatness came from the rice. Why should I and mine not be fat from the rice in the same way? And I thought it out in camp, silent, morose, while the children squabbled about me unnoticed, and while Arunga, my mate-woman, vainly scolded me and urged me to go hunting for more meat for the many of us. Arunga was the woman I had stolen from the hill tribes. She and I had been a dozen moons in learning common speech after I captured her. Ah, that day when I leaped upon her, down from the overhanging tree branch as she padded the runway. Fairly upon her shoulders with the weight of my body I smote her, my fingers wide spreading to clutch her. She squalled like a cat there in the runway. She fought me and bit me. The nails of her hands were like the claws of a tree cat as they tore at me. But I held her and mastered her, and for 2 days beat her and forced her to travel with me down out of the canyons of the hillmen to the grasslands where the river flowed through the rice swamps and the ducks and the blackbirds fed fat. I saw my vision when the rice was ripe. I put Arunga in the bow of the fire-hollowed log that was most rudely a canoe. I bade her paddle. In the stern I spread a deerskin she had tanned. With 2 stout sticks I bent the stalks over the deerskin and threshed out the grain that else the blackbirds would have eaten. And when I had worked out the way of it, I gave the 2 stout sticks to Arunga and sat in the bow paddling and directing. In the past we had eaten the raw rice in passing and had not been pleased with it, but now we parched it over our fire so that the grains puffed and exploded in whiteness and all the tribe came running to taste. After that we became known among men as the rice eaters and as the sons of the rice. And long, long after, when we were driven by the sons of the river from the swamps into the uplands, we took the seed of the rice with us and planted it. We learned to select the largest grains for the seed, so that all the rice we thereafter ate was larger grained and puffier in the parching and the boiling. But Arunga. I have said she squalled and scratched like a cat when I stole her. Yet I remember the time when her own kin of the hillmen caught me and carried me away into the hills. They were her father, his brother, and her 2 own blood brothers. But she was mine, who had lived with me. And at night, where I lay bound like a wild pig for the slaying, and they slept weary by the fire, she crept upon them and brained them with the war club that with my hands I had fashioned. And she wept over me, and loosed me, and fled with me, back to the wide sluggish river where the blackbirds and the wild ducks fed in the rice swamps, for this was before the time of the coming of the sons of the river. For she was Arunga, the one woman, the eternal woman. She has lived in all times and places. She will always live. She is immortal. Once in a far land her name was Ruth. Also has her name been Iseult, and Helen, Pocahontas, and Unga. And no stranger man from stranger tribes but has found her and will find her in the tribes of all the earth. I remember so many women who have gone into the becoming of the one woman. There was a time that Har, my brother, and I, sleeping and pursuing in turn, ever hounding the wild stallion through the daytime and night, and in a wide circle that met where the sleeping one lay, drove the stallion unresting through hunger and thirst to the meekness of weakness, so that in the end he could but stand and tremble while we bound him with ropes twisted of deer-hide. On our legs alone, without hardship, aided merely by wit, the plan was mine, my brother and I walked that fleet-footed creature into possession. And when all was ready for me to get on his back, for that had been my vision from the first, Selpa, my woman, put her arms about me and raised her voice and persisted that Har and not I should ride, for Har had neither wife nor young ones and could die without hurt. Also in the end she wept, so that I was raped of my vision, and it was Har, naked and clean, that bestrode the stallion when he vaulted away. It was sunset, and a time of great wailing, when they carried Har in from the far rocks where they found him. His head was quite broken, and like honey from a fallen bee-tree, his brains dripped on the ground. His mother strewed wood ashes on her head and blackened her face. His father cut off half the fingers of one hand in token of sorrow. And all the women, especially the young and unwedded, screamed evil names at me, and the elders shook their wise heads and muttered and mumbled that not their fathers nor their fathers' fathers had betrayed such a madness. Horse meat was good to eat, young colts were tender to old teeth, and only a fool would come to close grapples with any wild horse, save when an arrow had pierced it, or when it struggled on the stake in the midst of the pit. And Selpa scolded me to sleep, and in the morning woke me with her chatter, ever declaiming against my madness, ever pronouncing her claim upon me and the claims of our children, till in the end I grew weary, and forsook my far vision, and said never again would I dream of bestriding the wild horse to fly swift as its feet in the wind across the sands and the grasslands. And through the years the tale of my madness never ceased from being told over the campfire. Yet was the very telling the source of my vengeance, for the dream did not die, and the young ones, listening to the laugh and the sneer, re-dreamed it, so that in the end it was Othar, my eldest born, himself a sheer stripling, that walked down a wild stallion, leapt on its back, and flew before all of us with the speed of the wind. Thereafter, that they might keep up with him, all men were trapping and breaking wild horses. Many horses were broken, and some men, but I lived at the last to the day when, at the changing of campsites in the pursuit of the meat in its seasons, our very babes, in baskets of willow withes, were slung side by side on the backs of our horses that carried our camp trappage and dunnage. I, a young man, had seen my vision, dreamed my dream. Selpa, the woman, had held me from that far desire, but Othar, the seed of us to live after, glimpsed my vision and won to it, so that our tribe became wealthy in the gains of the chase. There was a woman, on the great drift down out of Europe, a weary drift of many generations, when we brought into India the short-horn cattle and the planting of barley. But this woman was long before we reached India. We were still in the midmost of that centuries-long drift, and no shrewdness of geography can now place for me that ancient valley. The woman was Nuhila. The valley was narrow, not long, and the swift slope of its floor and the steep walls of its rims were terraced for the growing of rice and of millet, the first rice and millet we sons of the mountain had known. They were a meek people in that valley. They had become soft with the farming of fat land made fatter by water. Theirs was the first irrigation we had seen, although we had little time to mark their ditches and channels by which all the hill waters flowed to the fields they had builded. We had little time to mark, for we sons of the mountain, who were few, were in flight before the sons of the snub-nose, who were many. We called them the noseless, and they called themselves the sons of the eagle. But they were many, and we fled before them with our short-horn cattle, our goat and our barley seed, our women and children. While the snub-noses slew our youths at the rear, we slew at our fore the folk of the valley who opposed us and were weak. The village was mud-built and grass-thatched. The encircling wall was of mud, but quite tall. And when we had slain the people who had built the wall, and sheltered within it our herds and our women and children, we stood on the wall and shouted insult to the snub-noses. for we had found the mud granaries filled with rice and millet. Our cattle could eat the thatches, and the time of the rains was at hand, so that we should not want for water. It was a long siege. Near to the beginning, we gathered together the women and elders and children we had not slain, and forced them out through the wall they had builded. But the Snub-Noses slew them to the last one, so that there was more food in the village for us, more food in the valley for the Snub-Noses. It was a weary, long siege. Sickness smote us, and we died of the plague that arose from our buried ones. We emptied the mud granaries of their rice and millet. Our goats and shorthorns ate the thatch of the houses, and we, ere the end, ate the goats and the shorthorns. Where there had been 5 men of us on the wall, there came a time when there was 1. Where there had been 1,000 babes and younglings of ours, there were none. It was Nuhila, my woman, who cut off her hair and twisted it that I might have a strong string for my bow. The other women did likewise, and when the wall was attacked, stood shoulder to shoulder with us, in the midst of our spears and arrows, raining down potsherds and cobblestones on the heads of the Snub-Noses. Even the patient Snub-Noses we well nigh outpatienced. Came a time when of 10 men of us but 1 was alive on the wall, and of our women remained very few, and the Snub-Noses held parley. They told us we were a strong breed, and that our women were men-mothers, and that if we would let them have our women, they would leave us alone in the valley to possess for ourselves, and that we could get women from the valleys to the south. And Nuhila said no, and the other women said no. And we sneered at the Snub-Noses and asked if they were weary of fighting. And we were as dead men then, as we sneered at our enemies, and there was little fight left in us, we were so weak. One more attack on the wall would end us. We knew it, our women knew it, and Nuhila said that we could end it first and outwit the Snub-Noses, and all our women agreed. And while the Snub-Noses prepared for the attack that would be final, there, on the wall, we slew our women. Nuhila loved me, and leaned to meet the thrust of my sword there on the wall. And we men, in the love of tribehood and tribesmen, slew one another till remained only Horda and I alive in the red of the slaughter. And Horda was my elder, and I leaned to his thrust. But not at once did I die. I was the last of the sons of the mountain, and I saw Horda himself fall on his blade and pass quickly. And dying with the shouts of the oncoming Snub-Noses growing dim in my ears, I was glad that the Snub-Noses would have no sons of us to bring up by our women. I do not know when this time was when I was a son of the mountain, and when we died in the narrow valley where we had slain the sons of the rice and the millet. I do not know, save that it was centuries before the wide-spreading drift of all of us sons of the mountain fetched into India, and that it was long before ever I was an Aryan master of old Egypt, building my 2 burial places, and defacing the tombs of kings before me. I should like to tell more of those far days, but time in the present is short. Soon I shall pass. Yet am I sorry that I cannot tell more of those early drifts, when there was crushage of peoples, or descending ice sheets, or migrations of meat. Also I should like to tell of mystery, for always were we curious to solve the secrets of life, death, and decay. Unlike other animals, man was forever gazing at the stars. Many gods he created in his own image and in the images of his fancy. In those old times I have worshipped the sun and the dark. I have worshipped the husked grain as the parent of life. I have worshipped Sar, the corn goddess, and I have worshipped sea gods and river gods and fish gods. Yes, and I remember Ishtar, ere she was stolen from us by the Babylonians, and Ea, too, was ours, supreme in the underworld, who enabled Ishtar to conquer death. Mitra, likewise, was a good old Aryan god, ere he was filched from us or we discarded him. And I remember on a time, long after the drift when we brought the barley into India, that I came down into India, a horse-trader, with many servants and a long caravan at my back, and at that time they were worshipping Bodhisattva. Truly, the worships of the mystery wandered as did men, and between filchings and borrowings, The gods had as vagabond a time of it as did we. And as the Sumerians took the loan of Shamashnapishtim from us, so did the sons of Shem take him from the Sumerians and call him Noah. Why, I smile me today, Darrell Standing, in Murderers' Row, in that I was found guilty and awarded death by 12 jurymen, staunch and true. 12 has ever been a magic number of the mystery. Nor did it originate with the 12 tribes of Israel. Stargazers before them had placed the 12 signs of the zodiac in the sky. And I remember me, when I was of the Asur and of the Vanir, that Odin sat in judgment over men in the court of the 12 gods, and that their names were Thor, Baldur, Njord, Frey, Tyr, Bregi, Heimdall, Hoder, Vidar, Ul, Forseti, and Loki. Even our Valkyries were stolen from us and made into angels, and the wings of the Valkyries' horses became attached to the shoulders of the angels. And our Helheim of that day of ice and frost has become the hell of today, which is so hot an abode that the blood boils in one's veins, while with us, in our Helheim, the place was so cold as to freeze the marrow inside the bones. And the very sky that we dreamed enduring, eternal, has drifted and veered, so that we find today the scorpion in the place where of old we knew the goat, and the archer in the place of the crab. Worships and worships, ever the pursuit of the mystery. I remember the lame god of the Greeks, the master-smith. But their Vulcan was the Germanic Wieland, the master-smith, captured and hamstrung lame of a leg by Nidung, the kind of the Nids. But before that he was our master-smith, our forager and hammerer, whom we named Ilmarinen. And him we beget of our fancy, giving him the bearded sun-god for father, and nursing him by the stars of the Bear. For he, Vulcan, or Wieland, or Ilmarinen, was born under the pine tree, from the hair of the wolf, and was called also the Bear-father, ere ever the Germans and the Greeks purloined and worshipped him. In that day we called ourselves the sons of the Bear and the sons of the Wolf, and the Bear and the Wolf were our totems. That was before our drift south, on which we joined with the sons of the tree grove and taught them our totems and tales. Yes, and who was Kashyapa? Who was Pururavas, but our lame master-smith, our iron-worker, carried by us in our drifts, and renamed and worshipped by the south-dwellers and the east-dwellers, the sons of the pole and of the fire-drill and fire-socket. But the tale is too long, though I should like to tell of the 3-leaved herb of life, by which Sigmund made Sinfioti alive again. For this is the very soma plant of India, the holy grail of King Arthur, But enough, enough. And yet, as I calmly consider it all, I conclude that the greatest thing in life, in all lives, to me and to all men, has been woman, is woman, and will be woman, so long as the stars drift in the sky and the heavens flux eternal change. Greater than our toil and endeavor, the play of invention and fancy, battle and star-gazing and mystery, greatest of all has been woman. Even though she has sung false music to me, and kept my feet solid on the ground, and drawn my star-roving eyes ever back to gaze upon her, she, the conserver of life, the Earth Mother, has given me my great days and nights and fullness of years. Even mystery have I imagined in the form of her, and in my star-charting have I placed her figure in the sky. All my toils and devices led to her. All my far visions saw her at the end. When I made the fire-drill and fire-socket, it was for her. It was for her, although I did not know it, that I put the stake in the pit for old Saber-Tooth, tamed the horse, slew the mammoth, and herded my reindeer south in advance of the ice sheet. For her I harvested the wild rice, tamed the barley, the wheat, and the corn. For her, and the seed to come after whose image she bore, I have died in tree-tops and stood long sieges in cave-mouths and on mud walls. For her I put the 12 signs in the sky. It was she I worshipped when I bowed before the 10 stones of jade and adored them as the moons of gestation. Always has woman crouched close to earth like a partridge hen mothering her young. Always has my wantonness of roving led me out on the shining ways, and always have my star paths returned me to her, the figure everlasting, the woman, the one woman, for whose arms I had such need that clasped in them I have forgotten the stars. For her I accomplished odysseys, scaled mountains, crossed deserts. For her I led the hunt and was forward in battle. And for her and to her I sang my songs of the things I had done. All ecstasies of life and rhapsodies of delight have been mine because of her. And here, at the end, I can say that I have known no sweeter, deeper madness of being than to drown in the fragrant glory and forgetfulness of her hair. One word more. I remember me Dorothy, just the other day, when I still lectured on agronomy to farmer boy students. She was 11 years old. Her father was dean of the college. She was a woman child, and a woman, and she conceived that she loved me. And I smiled to myself, for my heart was untouched and lay elsewhere. Yet was the smile tender, for in the child's eyes I saw the woman eternal, the woman of all times and appearances. In her eyes I saw the eyes of my mate of the jungle and treetop, of the cave and squatting place. In her eyes I saw the eyes of Igar when I was Ushu the archer, the eyes of Arunga when I was the rice harvester, the eyes of Selpa when I dreamed of bestriding the stallion, the eyes of Nuhila who leaned to the thrust of my sword. Yes, there was that in her eyes that made them the eyes of Lili, whom I left with a laugh on my lips, the eyes of the Lady Om, for 40 years my beggar mate on highway and byway, the eyes of Philippa, for whom I was slain on the grass in old France, the eyes of my mother, when I was the lad Jesse at the mountain meadows in the circle of our 40 great wagons. She was a woman child, but she was daughter of all women, as her mother before her, and she was the mother of all women to come after her. She was Sar, the corn goddess. She was Ishtar, who conquered death. She was Sheba and Cleopatra. She was Esther and Herodias. She was Mary the Madonna, and Mary the Magdalene, and Mary the sister of Martha. Also she was Martha. And she was Brunhilde and Guinevere, Iseult and Juliet, Heloise and Nicolette. Yes, and she was Eve. She was Lilith. She was Astarte. She was 11 years old, and she was all women that had been, all women to be. I sit in my cell now, while the flies hum in the drowsy summer afternoon, and I know that my time is short. Soon they will apparel me in the shirt without a collar. But hush, my heart. The spirit is immortal. After the dark I shall live again, and there will be women. The future holds the little women for me in the lives I am yet to live. And though the stars drift and the heavens lie, ever remains woman, resplendent, eternal, the one woman, as I, under all my masquerades and misadventures, am the one man, her mate. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Jacket by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Barry Eads. My time grows very short. All the manuscript I have written is safely smuggled out of the prison. There is a man I can trust who will see that it is published. No longer am I in Murderer's Row. I am writing these lines in the death cell, and the death watch is set on me. Night and day is this death watch on me, and its paradoxical function is to see that I do not die. I must be kept alive for the hanging, or else will the public be cheated, the law blackened, and a mark of demerit placed against the time-serving warden who runs this prison, and one of whose duties is to see that his condemned ones are duly and properly hanged. Often I marvel at the strange way some men make their livings. This shall be my last writing. Tomorrow morning the hour is set. The governor has declined to pardon or reprieve, despite the fact that the Anti-Capital Punishment League has raised quite a stir in California. The reporters are gathered like so many buzzards. I have seen them all. They are queer young fellows, most of them, and most queer is it that they will thus earn bread and butter, cocktails and tobacco, room rent, and if they are married, shoes and school books for their children, by witnessing the execution of Professor Darrell Standing, and by describing for the public how Professor Darrell Standing died at the end of a rope. Ah, well, they will be sicker than I at the end of the affair. As I sit here and muse on it all, the footfalls of the death watch going up and down outside my cage, the man's suspicious eyes ever peering in on me, almost I weary of eternal recurrence. I have lived so many lives. I weary of the endless struggle and pain and catastrophe that come to those who sit in the high places, tread the shining ways, and wander among the stars. Almost I hope, when next I re-inhabit form, that it shall be that of a peaceful farmer. There is my dream farm. I should like to engage just for one whole life in that. Oh, my dream farm, my alfalfa meadows, my efficient Jersey cattle, my upland pastures, my brush-covered slopes melting into tilled fields, while ever higher up the slopes my Angora goats eat away brush to tillage. There is a basin there, a natural basin high up in the slopes, with a generous watershed on 3 sides. I should like to throw a dam across the 4th side, which is surprisingly narrow. At a paltry price of labor I could impound 20 million gallons of water. For see, one great drawback to farming in California is our long dry summer. This prevents the growing of cover crops, and the sensitive soil, naked, a mere surface dust mulch, has its humus burned out of it by the sun. Now with that dam I could grow 3 crops a year, observing due rotation, and be able to turn under a wealth of green manure. I have just endured a visit from the warden. I say endured advisedly. He is quite different from the warden of San Quentin. He is very nervous, and perforce I had to entertain him. This is his first hanging. He told me so. And I, with a clumsy attempt at wit, did not reassure him when I explained that it was also my first hanging. He was unable to laugh. He has a girl in high school, and his boy is a freshman at Stanford. He has no income outside his salary, his wife is an invalid, and he is worried in that he has been rejected by the life insurance doctors as an undesirable risk. Really, the man told me almost all his troubles. Had I not diplomatically terminated the interview, he would still be here telling me the remainder of them. My last 2 years in San Quentin were very gloomy and depressing. Ed Morrell, by one of the wildest freaks of chance, was taken out of solitary and made head trustee of the whole prison. This was Al Hutchins' old job, and it carried a graft of $3,000 a year. To my misfortune, Jake Oppenheimer, who had rotted in solitary for so many years, turned sour on the world, on everything. For 8 months he refused to talk even to me. In prison, news will travel. Give it time, and it will reach dungeon and solitary cell. It reached me, at last, that Cecil Winwood, the poet-forger, the snitcher, the coward, and the stool, was returned for a fresh forgery. It will be remembered that it was this Cecil Winwood who concocted the fairy story that I had changed the plant of the non-existent dynamite, and who was responsible for the 5 years I had then spent in solitary. I decided to kill Cecil Winwood. You see, Morrell was gone, and Oppenheimer, until the outbreak that finished him, had remained in the silence. Solitary had grown monotonous for me. I had to do something. So I remembered back to the time when I was Adam Strang and patiently nursed revenge for 40 years. What he had done, I could do if once I locked my hands on Cecil Winwood's throat. It cannot be expected of me to divulge how I came into possession of the 4 needles. They were small cambric needles. Emaciated as my body was, I had to saw 4 bars, each in 2 places, in order to make an aperture through which I could squirm. I did it. I used up 1 needle to each bar. This meant 2 cuts to a bar, and it took a month to a cut. Thus, I should have been 8 months in cutting my way out. Unfortunately, I broke my last needle on the last bar, and I had to wait 3 months before I could get another needle. But I got it, and I got out. I regret greatly that I did not get Cecil Winwood. I had calculated well on everything save one thing. The certain chance to find Winwood would be in the dining room at dinner hour. So I waited until Pie-Faced Jones, the sleepy guard, should be on shift at the noon hour. At that time I was the only inmate of solitary, so that Pie-Faced Jones was quickly snoring. I removed my bars, squeezed out, stole past him along the ward, opened the door and was free, to a portion of the inside of the prison. And here was the one thing I had not calculated on: myself. I had been 5 years in solitary. I was hideously weak. I weighed 87 pounds. I was half blind. And I was immediately stricken with agoraphobia. I was affrighted of spaciousness. 5 years in narrow walls had unfitted me for the enormous declivity of the stairway, for the vastitude of the prison yard. The descent of that stairway I consider the most heroic exploit I ever accomplished. The yard was deserted. The blinding sun blazed down on it. Thrice I essayed to cross it, but my senses reeled, and I shrank back to the wall for protection. Again, summoning all my courage, I attempted it. But my poor blear eyes, like a bat's, startled me at my shadow on the flagstones. I attempted to avoid my own shadow, tripped, fell over it, and like a drowning man struggling for shore, crawled back on hands and knees to the wall. I leaned against the wall and cried. It was the first time in many years that I had cried. I remember noting, even in my extremity, the warmth of the tears on my cheeks and the salt taste when they reached my lips. Then I had a chill, and for a time shook as with an ague. Abandoning the openness of the yard as too impossible a feat for one in my condition, still shaking with the chill, crouching close to the protecting wall, my hands touching it, I started to skirt the yard. Then it was, somewhere along, that the guard Thurston espied me. I saw him, distorted by my bleared eyes, a huge, well-fed monster, rushing upon me with incredible speed out of the remote distance. Possibly at that moment he was 20 feet away. He weighed 170 pounds. The struggle between us can be easily imagined. But somewhere in that brief struggle it was claimed that I struck him on the nose with my fist to such purpose as to make that organ bleed. At any rate, being a lifer, and the penalty in California for battery by a lifer being death, I was so found guilty by a jury which could not ignore the asseverations of the guard Thurston and the rest of the prison hangdogs that testified, and I was so sentenced by a judge who could not ignore the law as spread plainly on the statute book. I was well pummeled by Thurston, and all the way back up that prodigious stairway I was roundly kicked, punched, and cuffed by the horde of trustees and guards who got in one another's way in their zeal to assist him. Heavens, if his nose did bleed, the probability is that some of his own kind were guilty of causing it in the confusion of the scuffle. I shouldn't care if I were responsible for it myself, save that it is so pitiful a thing for which to hang a man. I have just had a talk with the man on shift of my death watch. A little less than a year ago, Jake Oppenheimer occupied this same death cell on the road to the gallows which I will tread tomorrow. This man was one of the death watch on Jake. He is an old soldier. He chews tobacco constantly and untidily, for his gray beard and mustache are stained yellow. He is a widower, with 14 living children, all married, and is the grandfather of 31 living grandchildren, and the great-grandfather of 4 younglings, all girls. It was like pulling teeth to extract such information. He is a queer old codger, of a low order of intelligence. That is why, I fancy, he has lived so long and fathered so numerous a progeny. His mind must have crystallized 30 years ago. His ideas are none of them later than that vintage. He rarely says more than yes and no to me. It is not because he is surly. He has no ideas to utter. I don't know, when I live again, but what one incarnation such as his would be a nice vegetative existence in which to rest up ere I go star-roving again. But to go back. I must take a line in which to tell, after I was hustled and bustled, kicked and punched up that terrible stairway by Thurston and the rest of the prison dogs, of the infinite relief of my narrow cell when I found myself back in solitary. It was so safe, so secure. I felt like a lost child returned home again. I loved those very walls that I had so hated for 5 years. All that kept the vastness of space, like a monster, from pouncing upon me were those good stout walls of mine, close to hand on every side. Agoraphobia is a terrible affliction. I have had little opportunity to experience it, but from that little I can only conclude that hanging is a far easier matter. I have just had a hearty laugh. The prison doctor, a likable chap, has just been in to have a yarn with me, incidentally to proffer me his good offices in the matter of dope. Of course I declined his proposition to shoot me so full of morphine through the night that tomorrow I would not know, when I marched to the gallows, whether I was coming or going. But the laugh, it was just like Jake Oppenheimer. I can see the lean keenness of the man as he strung the reporters with his deliberate bull which they thought involuntary. It seems, his last morning, breakfast finished, encased in the shirt without a collar, that the reporters, assembled for his last word in his cell, asked him for his views on capital punishment. Who says we have more than the slightest veneer of civilization coated over our raw savagery when a group of living men can ask such a question of a man about to die and whom they are to see die? But Jake was ever game. "Gentlemen," he said, "I hope to live to see the day when capital punishment is abolished." I have lived many lives through the long ages. Man, the individual, has made no moral progress in the past 10,000 years. I affirm this absolutely. The difference between an unbroken colt and the patient draught horse is purely a difference of training. Training is the only moral difference between the man of today and the man of 10,000 years ago. Under his thin skin of morality, which he has had polished onto him, he is the same savage that he was 10,000 years ago. Morality is a social fund, an accretion through the painful ages. The new-born child will become a savage unless it is trained, polished, by the abstract morality that has been so long accumulating. Thou shalt not kill. Piffle! They are going to kill me tomorrow morning. Thou shalt not kill. Piffle! In the shipyards of all civilized countries they are laying today the keels of dreadnoughts and of super-dreadnoughts. Dear friends, I, who am about to die, salute you with piffle. I ask you, what finer morality is preached today than was preached by Christ, by Buddha, by Socrates and Plato, by Confucius, and whoever was the author of the Mahabharata? Good Lord, 50,000 years ago, in our totem families, our women were cleaner, our family and group relations more rigidly right. I must say that the morality we practiced in those old days was a finer morality than is practiced today. Don't dismiss this thought hastily. Think of our child labor, of our police graft and our political corruption, of our food adulteration and of our slavery of the daughters of the poor. When I was a son of the mountain and a son of the bull, prostitution had no meaning. We were clean, I tell you. We did not dream such depths of depravity. Yea, so are all the lesser animals of today clean. It required man, with his imagination, aided by his mastery of matter, to invent the deadly sins. The lesser animals, the other animals, are incapable of sin. I read hastily back through the many lives of many times and many places. I have never known cruelty more terrible, nor so terrible, as the cruelty of our prison system of today. I have told you what I have endured in the jacket and in solitary in the first decade of this 20th century after Christ. In the old days we punished drastically and killed quickly. We did it because we so desired, because of whim, if you so please. But we were not hypocrites. We did not call upon press and pulpit and university to sanction us in our willfulness of savagery. What we wanted to do we went and did, on our legs upstanding, and we faced all reproof and censure on our legs upstanding, and did not hide behind the skirts of classical economists and bourgeois philosophers, nor behind the skirts of subsidized preachers, professors, and editors. Why, goodness me, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 5 years ago, in these United States, assault and battery was not a civil capital crime. But this year, the year of our Lord, 1913, in the state of California, they hanged Jake Oppenheimer for such an offense. And tomorrow, for the civil capital crime of punching a man on the nose, they are going to take me out and hang me. Query: doesn't it require a long time for the ape and the tiger to die when such statutes are spread on the statute book of California in the 1913th year after Christ? Lord, Lord, they only crucified Christ. They have done far worse to Jake Oppenheimer and me. As Ed Morrell once rapped to me with his knuckles, the worst possible use you can put a man to is to hang him. No, I have little respect for capital punishment. Not only is it a dirty game, degrading to the hangdogs who personally perpetrate it for a wage, but it is degrading to the Commonwealth that tolerates it, votes for it, and pays the taxes for its maintenance. Capital punishment is so silly, so stupid, so horribly unscientific. To be hanged by the neck until dead is society's quaint phraseology. Morning is come, my last morning. I slept like a babe throughout the night. I slept so peacefully that once the death watch got a fright. He thought I had suffocated myself in my blankets. The poor man's alarm was pitiful. His bread and butter was at stake. Had it truly been so, it would have meant a black mark against him, perhaps discharge, and the outlook for an unemployed man is bitter just at present. They tell me that Europe began liquidating 2 years ago, and that now the United States has begun. That means either a business crisis or a quiet panic, and that the armies of the unemployed will be large next winter, the breadlines long. I have had my breakfast. It seemed a silly thing to do, but I ate it heartily. The warden came with a quart of whiskey. I presented it to Murderer's Row with my compliments. The warden, poor man, is afraid, if I be not drunk, that I shall make a mess of the function and cast reflection on his management. They have put on me the shirt without a collar. It seems I am a very important man this day. Quite a lot of people are suddenly interested in me. The doctor has just gone. He has taken my pulse. I asked him to. It is normal. I write these random thoughts, and, a sheet at a time, they start on their secret way out beyond the walls. I am the calmest man in the prison. I am like a child about to start on a journey. I am eager to be gone, curious for the new places I shall see. This fear of the lesser death is ridiculous to one who has gone into the dark so often and lived again. The warden with a quart of champagne. I have dispatched it down Murderer's Row. Queer, isn't it, that I am so considered this last day? It must be that these men who are to kill me are themselves afraid of death. To quote Jake Oppenheimer, I, who am about to die, must seem to them something god-awful. Ed Morrell has just sent word in to me. They tell me he has paced up and down all night outside the prison wall. Being an ex-convict, they have red-taped him out of seeing me to say goodbye. Savages? I don't know. Possibly just children. I'll wager most of them will be afraid to be alone in the dark tonight after stretching my neck. But Ed Morrell's message. My hand is in yours, old pal. I know you'll swing off game. The reporters have just left. I'll see them next and last time from the scaffold ere the hangman hides my face in the black cap. They will be looking curiously sick. Queer young fellows. Some show that they have been drinking. 2 or 3 look sick with foreknowledge of what they have to witness. It seems easier to be hanged than to look on. My last lines. It seems I am delaying the procession. My cell is quite crowded with officials and dignitaries. They are all nervous. They want it over. Without a doubt, some of them have dinner engagements. I am really offending them by writing these few words. The priest has again preferred his request to be with me to the end. The poor man, Why should I deny him that solace? I have consented, and he now appears quite cheerful. Such small things make some men happy. I could stop and laugh for a hearty 5 minutes, if they were not in such a hurry. Here I close. I can only repeat myself. There is no death. Life is spirit, and spirit cannot die. Only the flesh dies and passes, ever acrawl with the chemic ferment that informs it, ever plastic, ever crystallizing, only to melt into the flux and to crystallize into fresh and diverse forms that are ephemeral and that melt back into the flux. Spirit alone endures and continues to build upon itself through successive and endless incarnations as it works upward toward the light. What shall I be when I live again? I wonder. I wonder. End of chapter 22. End of The Jacket by Jack London.